Chapter 194. It only took Grim and Mary 14 seconds to finish the first round of attacks on the green dragon. This round of attacks caused a lot of damage to the green dragon. If the same amount of damage was transferred to a radiant knight, it would be enough to make him unable to stand up. However, it was only a minor injury to the huge green dragon. 15 seconds later, Coggin and Farrell took over the second round of attacks on the green dragon, while Grim and the Lord of the Flames joined hands to chant a large-scale fire spell. Squeaking vampire bats circled around the plaza. Every time they saw a city guard approaching, they would shriek and dive down. His body was still in the air when he quickly transformed into his vampire form. He charged into the crowd without fear of death and started a bloody massacre. The fire spirits summoned by Grim in the first round of attacks were mainly fire spells, so they posed little threat to the green dragon, who had excellent magic resistance. Therefore, he was sent to the periphery by Grim to attack the surrounding buildings without restraint. He also conveniently covered the surrounding paths that led to the plaza with a sea of fire. With the help of these servants, Coggin and Farrell successfully completed the second round of attacks on the green dragon. As a potion master, Farrell's wizard robe and belt were full of small leather pouches. He flew above the green dragon and moved his fingers slightly. Between his fingers were all kinds of vulcanized test tubes and small bottles of reagents. 5 small bottles of reagents fell on the green dragon's body in a beautiful arc. The bottles broke, and a part of the green dragon's body was shrouded in a gray smoke. The gray smoke was like a living thing. It did not spread out like normal smoke, but instead tightly gathered around the green dragon's body and wriggled. The green dragon's scales that were enveloped by them quickly darkened and rusted away. The emerald green dragon scales turned lead gray and then into a colorless and transparent pale white. Without the protection of the dragon scales, the moment the gray smoke touched the flesh below, a sizzling sound of flesh and blood being corroded could be heard in the air. Another 3 bottles of vulcanized test tubes were thrown down and smashed on the green dragon's hard, curved horns and spine. Immediately, a dark purple aura of curse began to flash on the green dragon's body. Although most of the power of the curse was resisted by the dragon's extraordinary body, some of the power still seeped into the green dragon's body, causing the angry flames in its huge eyes to dim. Farrell did not try to get close to the green dragon. Instead, she used her wind wings to float in the air and continuously threw all kinds of potions on the green dragon's body. Each of the potions could create a very special spell effect, such as a curse aura, a corrosive spell, or an offensive spell. Farrell even used the potions to summon vampiric vines and blood snakes, which drilled into the green dragon's body and attacked its flesh without restraint. As for Wizard Coggin, his attacks were even stranger. He rushed to the side of a badly mangled wound on the green dragon's chest and roared. His right hand instantly cast sharpness and puncture, and then he stabbed into the flesh. The green dragon's flesh was tough and dense. Even without the protection of scales, it was as tough as normal enchanted leather armor. Therefore, Coggin's right hand could only barely reach the green dragon's wrist. Moreover, when Coggin's right hand came into contact with the green dragon's strong tendons and the dragon's acidic blood, it instantly became riddled with scars. Coggin did not care about the damage on his hand. Instead, he roared loudly and completed a special transformation. His right hand, which was inserted into the green dragon's abdomen, suddenly became thick and soft. The exposed skin also became greenish-gray. In the blink of an eye, Coggin had transformed part of his body into a tentacle. Then, through the hollow tubes in the tentacles, he continuously injected a large amount of blood and flesh with special viruses and bacteria into the green dragon's body. In an instant, the green dragon's body felt like it was boiling. The scales on its body were undulating, as if there were countless ferocious beasts madly digging into it. The green dragon was in extreme pain. Once again, it let out an earth-shattering roar. It was obvious that it was asking for help. In fact, when the green dragon let out the first mournful roar, a terrifying energy wave suddenly burst out from the city lord's mansion in the distance. A disheveled humanoid figure of light rushed out of the palace, roaring as it strode toward the square. Correspondingly, several buildings around the palace lit up one after another. More than a dozen humanoid light bodies lit up and rushed towards the square. These humanoid light bodies were, of course, the Knights of Light who stayed behind in Hadurn City. Once they erupted their power, the runes around them would pour into their bodies and instantly turn them into light people. Judging from the positions of these Knights of Light, they were distributed near the palace. Obviously, they were focused on protecting the Great Dragon Knight. As for the green dragon Lysiana, why would such a powerful dragon worry about an enemy ambush? Among the dazzling humanoid light bodies, one was brighter than the others. His existence was like a small sun that illuminated the entire night sky. Every movement of his carried great power and terrifying momentum. When he roared and strode forward, a powerful energy wave rippled around him. It was as if the whole world was trembling along with his heavy footsteps. Unfortunately, he could not fly. Not even the Knights of Light could fly. Perhaps this was the greatest sorrow of all knights and warriors. When the world bestowed them with an incomparably tough physique and unparalleled power, it also deprived them of their agile bodies. Therefore, no matter how they roared and cursed, even if they destroyed the walls and chose the most convenient path, it was still a delusion to cross the 3 miles in one step. The green dragon, Lysiana's long, mournful hiss had obviously made the Dragon Knight anxious. He roared and smashed one wall after another, madly rushing toward the square. It could be seen that in order to be in a hurry, he had even used the charging battle technique that knights usually use to launch a surprise attack on the road. After 27 seconds of incantation, Grim and the Flame Lord finally completed the powerful fire element spell. In the dark and mysterious night sky, a red as bright as a morning star suddenly appeared in everyone's sight. The red dot grew larger and larger, carrying with it a terrifying momentum. It pierced through the clouds and descended from the sky, heading straight for the Grade 2 green dragon that was trying to protect its legs. Meteor Descent. This was a powerful spell with terrifying power. Only a powerful elemental monster like the Flame Lord, which possessed both fire and earth elements, could launch such a terrifying attack. Grim was only responsible for providing an abundant supply of fire elements and shortening the channeling time of this super spell. Seeing the terrifying power of the meteor falling from the sky, the Grade 3 Dragon Knight Kalek, who was 2 miles away, was shocked. He roared and condensed an energy spear in his hand, throwing it at the meteor with all his might. After the meteor pierced through the clouds, due to the intense friction, it was engulfed in flames and became a true meteor. The energy spear crossed the distance of 2 miles, but before it could even touch the meteor, it was evaporated by the flames and high temperature. However, the meteor was hit by the terrifying force, and its falling angle deviated slightly, smashing into the side of the green dragon. Since the meteor did not hit its target, the public square bore the full force of the meteor's terrifying momentum. A huge pit appeared at the place where the meteor entered the ground, and the surrounding bluestone slabs began to show cracks that were as dense as spider webs, spreading outwards layer by layer. The public square was silent for only 3 seconds before it exploded in the violent impact. First, all the slabs, sand, and buildings on top of them bounced off the ground, then shattered by the shockwave of the explosion, turning into a storm of fine sand and stones, crazily attacking the periphery. Although Grim and the other 3 Dragon Knights had gathered together to put up a strong protective barrier, they were still pushed back nearly 100 meters by the shockwave of the explosion. The green dragon, who was at the center of the explosion, became the biggest victim. A small portion of the shockwaves from the explosion had destroyed the dragon scales on the surface of its body, and the sharp bone spikes on its back had been melted and broken by the heat. The intense heat melted away the exposed flesh, and one of the dragon's wings was hit by the meteor, turning into meat paste and then incinerated into ashes. Lava gushed out of the crater and splashed on the green dragon's body, burning its flesh and making sizzling sounds. The green dragon, Lysiana's mournful roar was getting weaker and weaker. Since the local ruler did not allow a large number of demon hunter knights to be stationed in the city, most of the people patrolling the public square were the city guards, and they were the biggest victims of the terrifying witchcraft. In a fight between the strong, ordinary humans were like ants that could be squashed at any time. Even a small half of the vampires that Mary brought with her were engulfed in the terrifying flames and turned into ashes. The human warriors who could not protect themselves suffered even more casualties. Even the pebbles that were shot out along with the shockwave were enough to turn them into bloody sieves, not to mention the terrifying flames that reached nearly 100 degrees. However, even in such a violent and terrifying attack, the people could still feel the green dragon's weak breath of life in the flames and magma. This grade 2 green dragon's vitality was so strong that it was astounding. Even after suffering such a heavy blow, it did not die. Chapter 195. Theoretically, it was possible for a group of Tier 1 sorcerers to plot and kill a Tier 2 dragon. But in reality, it was very difficult to achieve. In fact, it was impossible. The biggest problem was that the dragon could fly. But today, with just 4 fledgling Tier 1 sorcerers, they had nearly created a terrifying record that would shock the world. Dragon slaying, but it was still a close call. Therefore, when the enraged knights were about to charge into the square, and their attacks on the green dragon were unable to extinguish its last breath of life, Grimm and the others could only regretfully give up. Today's battle was full of surprises and uncertainties, so they could not belittle the dragon's combat power. First of all, a Grade 2 green dragon could move freely. Even 10 Grade 1 wizards would not be able to kill it. That was why Farrell's dragon paralysis potion was the biggest factor behind today's battle. Secondly, the green dragon Lysana was alone, which was rare, in her daily activities. The green dragon Lysana would either go in and out with the Grade 3 Dragon Knight Kalek, or curl up in her beautiful palace and sleep soundly. Outside the palace, there were naturally demon hunters guarding it. But today, the delicate relationship between Hiduran City and the enemy made Grand Duke Ellington resolutely not allow a large group of demon hunters to enter the city. Therefore, the green dragon trapped in the city square could only be guarded by the city guards, and the servants serving the dragon were temporarily recruited from the slums. All these complicated karmic relationships had finally brought disaster to the green dragon, Lysiana. In less than 3 minutes, it was beaten to the brink of death by the 4 wizards who had been preparing for a long time. Unfortunately, no matter if it was Grimm who turned into a Balrog and swinging his giant beheading sword, or Mary who laid on the green dragon's chest and drank freely, or Wizard Kogan who turned into a giant tentacle monster and kept devouring the green dragon's flesh and blood, or Farrell who injected deadly fungus or terrifying plague into the green dragon's wounds. Even if they all used their trump cards. Even if the green dragon Lysana's last breath of life was so weak that it seemed like it would be extinguished at any moment. Unfortunately, the green dragon was still alive. Under Grimm's command, the fire djinns outside the square charged at the knights at high speed with heavy footsteps. Unfortunately, when it was halfway there, it bumped into a dozen powerful knight battle techniques like the half-moon slash, evil slash, and radiant holy sword. Unlike the magic-breaking knights, who needed the help of rune weapons to use their combat skills, the radiant knights could only rely on their powerful physical strength to trigger the violent rune power. Therefore, the fire djinn didn't even have time to struggle before it was blown up by a dozen knight battle skills. At this moment, the radiant knights had rushed to the edge of the plaza. They were only 400 to 500 meters away from Grimm and the others. As long as they moved forward another 100 meters, they would be able to bring Grimm and the others into the attack range of the knights' combat skills. At that time, they would only need one wave of attack to annihilate these annoying little bugs. The scene of the fire djinn being blown up by the radiant knights was too shocking. Seeing the powerful opponents rapidly approaching, Grim and the others could only bear the pain and give up the urge to slay the dragon, even though they were unwilling. Grim whistled as he put away the Flame Lord, and used Flame jump to escape without saying a word. A huge fireball suddenly exploded, and Grim disappeared. On the other side of the square, a pillar of fire rose into the sky, and Grim walked out from it. Grim grinned maliciously as he waved his hand, unleashing a barrage of fireballs that blasted some of the city guards around him into pieces. Once the flames around him had stabilized, he lowered his body and used the swift flame leap again. Corgan and Farrell were not good at flying, so they didn't dare to be careless. They used their special skills, turning into black smoke or growing wings of wind, and quickly left the battlefield. Only Mary was too greedy, desperately devouring the dragon blood. Even if the dragon blood was full of strong acid and toxins, she didn't hesitate to turn green. When the Radiant Knights were within 300 meters of her, she reluctantly flew into the sky. Her huge bat wings suddenly spread open, and she quickly escaped from the battlefield. You damned reptiles, stay here." A furious snort suddenly rang out. Soon after, a terrifying blazing sun rose among the many Radiance Knights, unscrupulously releasing terrifying energy ripples in all directions. Grade 3 Dragon Knight Karek. As he roared furiously, an energy spear formed from pure runic energy quickly took shape in his hand. He then hurled it with all his might, and it turned into a streak of rainbow light that streaked across the sky, piercing straight toward Mary, who was flapping her wings as she flew. Mary's body turned, and the blood-red longbow flashed. More than a dozen blood-red arrows hit the tip of the energy spear. Unfortunately, it was like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. The blood-red arrows, which had less than 13 degrees of attack power, were like bubbles under the sun in front of the energy spear. Even if their numbers were endless, it was still difficult for them to stop the energy spear's advance. "Don't block it, Dodge," Corgan and Farrell shouted, but it was too late. The energy spear suddenly pierced towards Mary's chest with the momentum of 1,000 troops. With the runic energy condensed by a Grade 3 Dragon Knight, after the explosion, the energy spear was enough to blast Mary into pieces, leaving no flesh or blood behind. At this critical moment, an explosive fireball broke through the air and exploded beside Mary. Although the violent flame shockwave could not shake the energy spear, it blew Mary away at the most critical moment. The energy spear did not pierce Mary's body, but only her right leg. Then, like a blender, the energy wave engulfed half of Mary's body. In the sudden explosion of the energy storm, Mary's broken body shot out like a sharp arrow. Finally, she was not affected by the energy wave that was chasing after her. When she completely escaped from the energy storm, only a small half of her enchanting and perfect body was left. Almost everything below her chest was missing. Such a terrifying injury would have killed a normal person, but for a vampire, it was not the most fatal injury. With the nourishment from the dragon blood, Mary flew with all her might, and the lower half of her body quickly regenerated. "Let's go, get out of here," Corgan shouted. The few of them did not even look back as they ran for their lives. For strange streaks of different colors were left in the dark night sky, and it took a long time for them to fade away. The Magi's escape skills were top-notch, but the vampires that were left behind were killed by the energy spears as soon as they flew into the sky. Only a few of them turned into vampire bats and did not fly into the sky. Instead, they quickly weaved through the crowd and escaped into the nearby alleys. Using this method, a few elite vampires successfully escaped the pursuit of the knights and hid in the sewers of Hiduran City. The sudden attack of the mysterious evildoers shook the entire Hiduran City. In the latter half of the night, squads of demon hunters rushed into the city and brought the entire city under their control. Then, they went from house to house, searching for traces of outsiders. Of course, the ordinary citizens were powerless against the demon hunter knights and could only allow them to search and search as they pleased. However, the wealthy merchants and nobles naturally wouldn't stand for such humiliation. Thus, conflicts of all sizes occurred one after another. Unfortunately, the dragon companion of the Grade 3 Dragon Knight was heavily injured and dying. This incident had completely infuriated the higher-ups of the Demon Hunter Knights. Thus, all servants, guards, and mercenaries who dared to stop the demon hunters were killed on the spot. The wealthy merchants and nobles were captured and brought into the knights' camp, becoming humiliated prisoners. For a moment, the entire Haduran city was in chaos, and the atmosphere was foul. The furious merchants and nobles blocked the main gate of the city lord's mansion, continuously protesting to the city hall. However, the city's ruler, led by Grand Duke Ellington, did not show up. Thus, all sorts of bad rumors began to spread. Many citizens were secretly discussing that Grand Duke Ellington had been placed under house arrest by the Dragon Knight. However, just as the chaos was unbearable, an important figure suddenly came to the Greenland forest a few hundred miles away. Flying a dragon thousands of feet high in the sky was not a comfortable thing to do. At such a height, just the wind blowing against one's face was enough to take away the last bit of warmth from one's body. Even if one was wrapped in a fur coat, one would still feel a bone-chilling chill. However, with Jefferson's violent physique as a Grade 3 Dragon Knight, he did not feel the slightest discomfort in such an environment. He bent down to look at the boundless forest beneath him. Everywhere he looked was lush greenery. It would be wishful thinking to find the team of demon hunters in such a dense forest. Jefferson gently patted the green dragon beneath him, and instantly understood. It folded its wings and dove down quickly. It raised its neck and let out a long dragon roar that resounded for dozens of miles. He could not find the team of demon hunters, but as long as they were still in the forest, they would naturally find a way to get in touch with him when they heard the iconic dragon roar. Thus, the green dragon spread its huge dragon wings less than 100 meters away from the treetops and circled along the undulating forest, letting out a loud dragon roar from time to time. With the dragon's astonishing flying speed and loud voice, as long as the demon hunters were not deaf, they would definitely hear it. Unfortunately, the green dragon circled several times in the air above this vast forest, which spanned hundreds of miles, but still did not detect any feedback from the forest below. Could it be that Knight had already led the team deep into the forest? Jefferson frowned. The doubt in his heart had just arisen, but it was quickly overruled. Knight was not one of those newly advanced magic breaker knights who would make impulsive decisions easily. If he really planned to lead the team deep into the forest, he would definitely send someone to inform the rear of his actions. However, Jefferson did not get any useful information from Blue Hill City. It seemed that the team of demon hunters had completely disappeared as soon as they entered the forest. Chapter 196. Within the Sorcerer Camp. A group of sorcerers were gathered in a corner of the camp, silently looking up at the black that was circling in the distant sky. Beside them, an enormous illusory boundary covered the entire valley, allowing it to completely blend into the surrounding forest. From the sky, it was impossible to see any flaws. Behind them, the Magus camp was bustling like a huge construction site. Countless mechanical beasts, wizard beasts, and elemental puppets were bustling about, and the embryonic form of a Magus tower was slowly taking shape. According to the original plan, a 9-story wizard tower that was more than 200 meters tall would be erected here. Its functions were similar to those of the Sorcerer World's mid-level sorcerer towers, which focused on defense and attack. The internal non-combat facilities had been greatly reduced. Such a sorcerer tower might not be comfortable to live in, but it was a necessary war fortress for the rapid expansion of the Sorcerer World. Every time he arrived at an unfamiliar plane, the first thing he did was to set up this simplified version of the War Wizard Tower. As long as they succeeded, at least the sorcerers who entered the plane would be able to break away from the shackles of the plane's laws within the range of the Sorcerer Tower, thereby creating the most favorable battle environment for the sorcerers in the local battlefield. At this time, the 3 underground floors of the Wizard Tower had been completely built, and only the first and second floors of the tower had been completed above ground. At this moment, Many mechanical beasts were seriously carving spell formations on the walls of the tower under the command of the Magi. After all, this was a foreign world, and it was impossible to transport all the construction materials through the costly ultra-long distance teleportation across planes. Therefore, the second batch of wizards brought along some rare materials and resources. As for the stone and wood used to build the tower, they could only use local materials. According to the normal construction of a wizard tower, the body of a tower would be built with multi-layer composite stone. The outer walls were naturally made of materials such as obsidian and steel rock that had powerful anti-magic properties, while the inner walls were made of special materials such as cyan stone, bloodstone, and volcanic rock that had good magic conductivity. However, as to which one to use, it usually depended on the individual attributes of the wizard stationed in the tower. A wizard tower built in this way would naturally create a living environment that was consistent with the attributes of the wizard stationed in the tower, which was beneficial to the strength of high-grade wizards. Unfortunately, in the other world, the lack of resources made all of this a dream. That was why this simple Wizard of War tower could only be built with local materials, and the stone used to build the tower was taken from the nearby mountains. The wizards had already commanded a large number of elemental puppets to dig up a small hill nearby, almost emptying it from the bottom. Using this method, they were able to support the huge amount of stone used to build the wizard tower. These ordinary mountain rocks and sedimentary rocks naturally did not have as good a witchcraft characteristic as the special stones, and the quality could not reach a satisfactory level. Therefore, the wizards could only use the method of carving a large number of fortifying spell formations on the walls of the tower to make up for the defects in the stone. This undoubtedly caused the consumption of rare materials and resources to become even greater. The consumption of resources in the early stages of conquering other planes was extremely terrifying. Even though it was just a simplified version of the Wizard of War's pagoda, it was enough to deplete the resource reserves of a small wizard family for decades. Furthermore, once the war was lost, the number of sorcerers and resources that could be successfully withdrawn from other planes would be even fewer. Most of the investments would be wasted. Therefore, the planar war was not only the only convenient way for some small and medium-sized sorcerer clans to quickly rise to power, but it was also a terrifying nightmare that could destroy a certain sorcerer clan's foundation. Therefore, every wizard clan had to be very careful when faced with unknown dimensions. Not only did they have to prevent the enemy clan from learning of their plans, they also had to hoard large amounts of resources in order to build the Wizard of War's pagoda in the shortest time possible, laying a solid foundation for the subsequent planar war. Yes, the true planar war had yet to begin. The numerous battles that Grimm and the rest had fought previously were at most the prelude and appetizer before the planar war began. The true planar war was much more brutal and bloody than regular wars. It was not something that a newbie like Grimm could imagine with his brain alone. Seeing the black that at the end of the horizon still lingering, a wizard could not help but curse angrily. With such a jinx hanging over their heads every day, the wizard camp did not dare carry out any major operations. The construction of the Wizard of War's pagoda would inevitably be affected. Sir Forgan, do you think we should send some wizard beasts to lure him away? Someone could not help but suggest. We can't act rashly. At the moment, there is not a single wizard in the camp who can fight against a level 3 Dragon Knight. If the location of the camp is exposed, I'm afraid it won't take long for the top experts of this dimension to catch wind of it. If that happens, the expansion plan that our family has been preparing for decades will have to be abandoned. Wizard Forgan shook his head coldly, rejecting his subordinate's suggestion. But it's not a good idea to let the Dragon Knight hang around here all the time. A wizard said worriedly, the illusory barrier can only extend to a height of 80 meters. Once the Wizard of War's pagoda is built, it will definitely be the most eye-catching landmark in this forest. As long as the Dragon Knight is not blind, there is no way he won't discover it. At that time, Wizard Forgan shook his head and said, do you think the Dragon Knights of this dimension are so worthless that they are willing to keep using level 3 Dragon Knights as sentries? In my opinion, this Dragon Knight is looking for the group of Demon Hunter Knights that were eliminated last time. If he can't find them, he will definitely... While they were talking, the Dragon Knight in the distant sky suddenly froze in midair and stopped moving. After a while, with a loud dragon's roar, the Dragon Knight turned around and flew southwest without looking back. Looking at the direction he left, he should be returning to Blue Hill City. Wizard Forgan was stunned for a moment, then turned around and ordered, "Contact Miri in Blue Hill City immediately. See if there are any changes." I feel like the Dragon Knight was in a hurry when he left, as if something happened. Yes. The wizards behind him bowed and immediately turned around to leave. A moment later, a Magus rushed back in a hurry. "Mr. Forgan, something has happened. Something big has happened." The four of them returned to Blue Hill City in the early morning of the next day. But before they could even sit down to catch their breath, Forgan's personal order was delivered to them. Hence, they hurried to the Magus camp without stopping. There, Forgan questioned them in detail about what they had done in Hiduran City. After listening to Wizard Forgan's story, all the family's wizards who stayed behind to guard the camp looked at each other, unable to believe what they had just heard. Even Mr. Forgan lowered his head and muttered to himself, "Ambushing a rank 2 green dragon? Turning the enemy's heavily guarded city upside down, and even beating the dragon companion of another Dragon Knight to the brink of death? Even the most melodramatic hero biographies wouldn't dare to fabricate such a bizarre and complicated story, right? That was a rank 2 giant dragon. To be honest, even a rank 2 wizard like Forgan would not be able to win against a rank 2 green dragon. After all, giant dragons could fly, and their magic and physical resistance were shockingly high. On top of that, adult giant dragons could also use draconic spells. Wasn't this the same as a combination of an elemental wizard and a physique wizard? The kind that could fly. So no matter what plane of existence, giant dragons had the terrifying ability to challenge enemies of a higher rank. The only reason why a rank 3 Dragon Knight chose a rank 2 giant dragon as his partner was because he could not defeat these flying, thick-skinned, and spitting dragons. Among the 4 wizards in front of him, 2 of them were newbies who had advanced less than half a year ago. How could they beat a rank 2 green dragon by working together? That did not sound very believable. But looking at the clues, it seemed that this was the only explanation for the Dragon Knight's strange behavior. Although it was important to search for the team of demon hunters in the forest, his companion was beaten half to death by a flying mount in his own camp. This was a serious matter, and he had no choice but to return to Hiduran City as soon as possible. Therefore, after thinking about it deeply, Forgan could only choose to believe them. But with this, it was hard to predict how the situation would develop in the future. They had annihilated a team of more than 100 demon hunters, and now there was such a brazen attack in Hiduran City. If they still could not guess that the intruders they were looking for were hiding nearby, they would really be a bunch of idiots. Cutting off the leg of a rank 3 Dragon Knight was indeed good news, but in exchange, the enemy's army might arrive earlier. The pros and cons of this matter needed to be weighed carefully. But Lord Forgan did not dare to let these people out in Blue Hill City. He could tell that these people weren't people who knew their place. If he left them outside, they would definitely stir up a big mess in a few days. So he could only force a smile and leave them in the camp. Grimm and the other 3 had obtained a lot of benefits in Hiduran City and needed a quiet place to digest them, so they accepted it calmly. Especially Mary, who could be said to have gained the most out of the 4. The vampires were always busy chasing after the blood of the strong. Corgan, Farrell, and Grimm had at most obtained some green dragon flesh as a top-grade spell material. But Mary could directly convert the dragon blood into blood energy to increase the upper limit of her strength. This terrifying ability was the most terrifying thing about the vampire race. So when they returned to the wizard camp, Mary went into seclusion again. Chapter 197. A small exploration team consisting of 5 people was trudging through the jungle with difficulty. This was an expedition team with powerful combat power, which could be seen from the composition of their team. A strong warrior was in charge of clearing a path in front of the team, using his greatsword to carve out a narrow path in the dense forest. There was a skinny thief following behind the warrior. The thief's beady eyes were constantly scanning the surrounding shadows and the mottled shadows of the trees. He appeared to be very cautious. Apart from that, there was also an archer who had his bow drawn and was on guard, as well as two powerful magic-breaking knights who had taken off their heavy knight armor and were only wearing chainmail. Dense forest, lush forest. As soon as one plunged in, one could only see shades of green. It was difficult to see any other color. Ancient tree roots stretched out, tough vines intertwined together, and bushes grew everywhere. In addition, there were many unknown wildflowers and weeds. It was enough to fill up the gaps between the tall, ancient trees. Traversing through such a primitive jungle was undoubtedly an extremely painful thing for unprepared travelers. Gurgling streams, mountain streams that were neither too high nor too low, lush and green valleys. These were common scenes in the forest. If they were in the plains, it would only take them a quarter of an hour to cross. However, in this dense forest, it would take them 2 to 4 hours to cross each one of them with great difficulty. The warrior, thief, and archer were experienced in the Greenland forest, so they didn't care about the difficulties in front of them. However, the two magic-breaking knights couldn't get used to the pain of trekking through mountains and rivers once they left their magic colts. They had only traveled less than 7 miles into the forest, and the two magic-breaking knights were already sweating profusely. They felt that the simple chain mail on their bodies was as heavy as a mountain. But even so, the two magic-breaking knights didn't complain about being tired, nor did they take the initiative to take a break. They clenched their teeth and held on, following behind the three adventurers step by step, exploring the forest before them bit by bit. After arriving at the bottom of a small cliff, the team finally stopped to rest. The two magic-breaking knights painfully moved their heavy bodies to the side of a flowing mountain stream and began to enjoy the cold water. The leader of the brute force warriors also did the same. If it weren't for him, it would have been impossible for these two knights who liked to wrap themselves in iron cans to reach this place. The archer was a middle-aged man with a thin body, thin lips, and sharp eyes. Unlike his companions, he didn't rush to the stream to drink. Instead, he leaned against a tall, ancient tree at the bottom of the cliff and looked around vigilantly. From time to time, he would tilt his head to listen to the movements in the forest. Any strange sound would cause him to hold his bow and wait. As long as he felt that something was wrong, the arrow on the bowstring would shoot out at the first moment. The thief was even more agile. While everyone was resting, he climbed to the top of the cliff using his hands and feet. He looked around, and from time to time, he bent down and gestured to the archer using sign language. "How is it? Did Jack discover anything?" One of the knights couldn't help but ask. Jack was the thief's name. The archer shook his head with a pale face. "Nothing. This forest is too quiet. I've been in the Greenland forest for 5 years, and I've never seen such a quiet forest. It's so quiet that I can't even find a small animal. My lord, this forest has been shrouded by an ominous aura. Should we go back?" The younger knight said in a deep voice with a firm face, "You can't go back. We hired you here to find out where the nest of the evildoers is. So before we find something, we can't go back. If you escape, you'll be severely punished when you go back. So let's give up on that stupid idea and think about how to complete the mission safely." The older knight took out an old leather map from his bosom and carefully marked their location on it. From a zigzagging route, it could be seen that they still had a long way to go in the forest. The brute warrior shrugged and showed a helpless expression when he heard the words of the knight. The archer, on the other hand, showed a distressed expression, and his expression became absent-minded. However, while he was in a daze, a vine hanging down from the tall ancient tree he was leaning against began to move strangely, even though there was no wind. Silently, the vine that was about to touch the ground coiled up like a snake and slowly raised its tentacles. The front of the vine suddenly split open, revealing a pair of beast-like fangs. just as the rattan slowly squirmed. The sharp teeth at the tip of the rattan were about to touch the neck of the archer. Luogwalu, the thief at the top of the cliff, leapt down. The throwing knife in his hand whistled past the archer's ear, striking the tip of the rattan's tentacle. Clang! The sound of metal clashing rang out, and the archer's body trembled violently. He didn't turn around, and instead, he rolled forward. The vine that was hit by the throwing knife not only didn't break, but even made a metallic sound similar to the collision of swords and knives. After being blocked by the throwing knife, the vine didn't bite the archer's neck. The sharp teeth collided with each other and made a strange sound. Apparently, knowing that it had been exposed, the wrinkled, ancient tree that was rooted at the bottom of the cliff let out a strange, squeaking sound. Its entire body actually pulled out fine and vigorous roots from the ground, twisting into lower limbs that looked like human legs, and slowly approached a few of them. And on its body, the dozens of hanging vines were waving in the sky, and at the end of the vines were sharp mouths, making all kinds of terrifying, biting sounds. Damn it, what kind of monster is this? The brute warrior roared loudly and waved the big sword in his hand as he rushed forward. As a small adventure team, such dangerous work like charging and breaking through enemy lines could only be done by him. His two companions couldn't handle such a strange and powerful monster. As for the two magic-breaking knights, as the employer, they had the right to remain neutral before the adventurers failed. The archer quickly distanced himself from the tree-like monster, and the bowstring in his hand was making continuous explosive sounds, shooting sharp arrows at the enemy like a line. Since it was also the first time he saw such a monster, and he couldn't identify the enemy's weak point, he could only choose to attack the thick trunk of the enemy. Obviously, the thief had the same idea as him, and the poisoned throwing knife in his hand was also aimed at the thick parts of the enemy's body. Unfortunately, most of the attacks from the two were smashed away by the rattan tentacles that were waving wildly. Even if the arrows and throwing knives occasionally hit the ancient tree, they didn't cause any damage to it. Obviously, this terrifying monster was not afraid of the attacks from small, sharp weapons. The brute force warriors circled around the ancient tree and slashed at it a few times. The tough bark on its body was chopped into chips, and green juice splashed everywhere. But before he could cause more damage, a thick root curled up from the ground and wrapped around his legs, dragging him to the ground. The ancient tree wriggled its legs and slowly moved towards the brute warrior. The rattan tentacles hanging down from the crown of the tree were constantly opening and closing, as if it wanted to skin the warrior alive. The two magic-breaking knights looked at each other and nodded knowingly, instantly activating their runic equipment. A translucent energy shield popped out from the small hand shield tied to the forearm of the left hand, and a wisp of elemental flame began to flicker on the runic sword in the right hand, gradually extending to the entire blade. Energy shield and flaming sword. The two magic-breaking knights were also experienced people, and they knew that fire was undoubtedly the biggest enemy of this kind of thick-skinned plant monster. One of the magic-breaking knights strode forward, swinging the flaming sword in his hand with great force. The flaming sword left a half-moon mark in the air and cut through the bundle of roots that bound the brute warrior. The roots were broken, and sticky green sap splattered everywhere. The ancient tree monster trembled in pain, and all the rattan tentacles moved to the front of its trunk, biting at the two magic-breaking knights. It had to be said that the magic-breaking knights with their runic equipment were the natural enemies of all monsters. The non-elemental energy shield could block almost all spells except for curses and penetration spells, and it also had good defense against physical attacks. This was enough to ensure the safety of the magic-breaking knights. Then, with the flaming sword in their hands, they could deal unimaginable damage to their enemies. If the adventurers were to deal with this ancient tree with its primitive bark armor, they would not be able to kill it without at least 7 or 8 casualties. But now, with the powerful defense and attack of the magic-breaking knights, they only had to pay the price of light injuries to the brute warrior to set the ancient tree on fire. That's right, when the magic-breaking knights cut a deep hole in the ancient tree and used their flames to ignite the green sap. The ancient tree let out an ear-piercing screech and fell into the sea of flames and agony. The three-man adventurer team was naturally very happy to be able to successfully destroy such a powerful monster. But just as they were about to happily plunder the burnt remains of the ancient tree, the two magic-breaking knights growled in a deep voice, "Come back. Get ready. The real enemy is coming." The three-man adventurer team was shocked to hear this. Such a powerful monster, was not the enemy's main force. Just as they were doubtful, the sound of flapping wings suddenly came from the nearby forest. Immediately, a large swarm of black shadows swarmed out of the forest, screaming as they rushed towards them. Bats. It's a group of bats. Chapter 198. In less than 17 seconds, the three-man adventurer team had turned into dried corpses. There were only two magic-breaking knights left in the field, back to back, fighting against the vampires with their energy shields and flaming swords. Unfortunately, most of these vampires were vampiric derivatives, and their strength was far inferior to the first-generation vampires that Mary had the embrace. Therefore, when they gathered into a cloud and circled around the two magic-breaking knights, not only did they fail to break through their defense, but they were also killed by the flaming runed swords and flaming blades. Just when the vampires were unable to break through, a red shadow flashed on the low cliff on the side of the battlefield, and a slender female figure appeared there, standing proudly alone. Bright red armor, a blood-red longbow, a sexy and hot body, a delicate and perfect face, and a pair of bloody red eyes, Mary stepped lightly on the rocks at the top of the cliff, showing her perfect female body in front of everyone, but she did not seem to care about the battle in front of her. Instead, she looked at the nearby forest. The forest was deep and the leaves were lush, and it was extremely difficult to see through the layers of green to see what was going on below. But at this moment, through the countless witchcraft eyes scattered in the vast forest, she could see the forest within 20 to 30 miles at a glance. The fixed witchcraft eyes, coupled with the moving vampire sentinels, made the dense forest no longer a hindrance. Instead, it became the best battlefield for her to attack and kill the Night Squad on a large scale. The Demon Hunter Knights suddenly entered Blue Hill City half a month ago. Their arrival had undoubtedly caused dissatisfaction among the local lords and nobles in Blue Hill City. Unfortunately, in the face of the extremely powerful Dragon Knights, all the local forces had to lower their heads and obediently listen to the orders of the Demon Hunter Knights. And the high-ranking officials of Blue Hill City who had become Mary's blood slaves also took the opportunity to lurk, continuously leaking the movements of the Demon Hunter Knights to the wizard camp. Now the two Dragon Knights had concluded that the group of abominable invaders must be hiding in the vast and deep forest in the southern part of the Greenland forest, which was 200 to 300 miles deep. And the identity of the enemy was obvious. They were a group of evil sorcerers from the sorcerer's world. This could be clearly seen after examining the pitiful green dragon that was heavily injured. In the vast plain world of the endless sea of stars, the sorcerer world had always been the nightmare of all the small and medium-sized material planes. This was a terrifyingly large plane full of aggression. It was inhabited by a group of evil wizards who crazily pursued knowledge and despised all social rules. Their minds were twisted, and they roamed the depths of the universe in groups, using their evil sorcery to look for weak planes that could bring them resources and wealth. They seemed to be fair. Everywhere they went, they shouted about equal exchange and fair trade. They seemed to be a group of spellcasters who abided by their principles. However, once they realized that the other party didn't have the strength to contend against them, they would immediately change their attitude. Sorcerers would use powerful force, terrifying sorcerer beasts, and terrifying plagues to weaken the will of those who resisted, and then forcibly enslave the enemy. They would support some obedient puppets in each occupied plane, and then order the local natives to mine mines for them, dig for gems, and use all their strength to squeeze out all the rare resources in the plane. In the hearts of the natives of the weak material planes, sorcerers were a group of twisted minds, extremely greedy, and terrible spellcasters with powerful evil sorcery. Once such a group of people broke into the plane and took root, what awaited the plane was endless humiliation and a life of forced slavery that lasted for thousands of years, until the last bit of resources in the plane was squeezed out. Therefore, once they determined that the invaders were a group of terrible evil sorcerers, the actions of the higher-ups of the knights accelerated without limit. The Demon Hunter Knights haven't finished assembling yet? Then assemble while fighting the war. The resources for the planar war haven't been fully prepared yet? Then prepare while fighting the war. The enemy's lair hasn't been fully explored yet? Then explore while fighting the war. The initial number of Demon Hunter Knights in Blue Hill City had reached more than 2,300, and the number of magic-breaking knights with the strength of a tier 1 sorcerer had also reached more than 150. As for the Radiant Knights, tier 2 sorcerers, who represented the higher-ups of the knights, there were more than 20 of them. There were even 2 Dragon Knights with the strength of a tier 3 Dragon Knight. Unfortunately, Dragon Knight Karek's Dragon Companion was seriously injured and could only temporarily return to the Dragon Cliff to recuperate. This undoubtedly meant that the Demon Hunter Knights had lost their most powerful mobile force. The Demon Hunter Knights had already gathered their troops. As long as they could determine the true location of the enemy's lair, they could march straight in and directly uproot the enemy. Unfortunately, due to the complex environment of the Greenland forest, the Dragon Knights' repeated high-altitude reconnaissance did not find any traces of the evil sorcerers. As a last resort, the higher-ups of the Knights could only send a large number of small teams to cooperate with the recruited adventurers and mercenaries to carry out a large-scale search in the southern area of the Greenland forest. In order to break the Knights' reconnaissance tactics, the sorcerers' camp had almost emptied all their resource reserves, concocted a large number of terrible wizard beasts, and then drove them into the surrounding forest. As a result, in this vast and deep sea of dense forest that spanned nearly 200 to 300 miles, countless terrible and cruel battles broke out far beyond the imagination of ordinary people. The number of human mercenaries, knights, and wizard beasts that had fallen in the mottled darkness was innumerable. After more than 10 days of bloody seesaw, the higher-ups of the Knights had also discovered that the reconnaissance teams, led by the Demon Hunter Knights, might be able to compete with the strange wizard beasts with different abilities. But once they encountered the evil sorcerers who wandered freely in the depths of the forest, they could only end up with a grievance, unable to even send the most basic information back. Therefore, in order to strengthen the survival ability of the reconnaissance teams, most of the team leaders were changed to powerful magic-breaking knights. These magic-breaking knights in groups of 2 could mostly survive even if they were attacked by the evil sorcerers as long as they were not extremely unlucky. They could also bring back extremely valuable strategic information for the rear. In order to resist the continuous infiltration of the knights, in addition to a large number of wizard beasts, the sorcerers' camp also selected 13 sorcerers and sent them to the southern forest. As a result, a large number of wizard beasts and evil sorcerers formed an invisible but real strangulation line in the southern forest of the Greenland forest, and a continuous stream of bloody and cruel hunting with the endless stream of night squads. However, as a few Radiant Knights disguised as magic-breaking knights mixed in with the squads, the situation on the battlefield became more and more chaotic and terrifying. Every day, there were horrifying rumors of the night squads being ambushed and the evil sorcerers being annihilated. Take the battle at the bottom of the cliff, for example. Mary clearly had the upper hand on the battlefield. As long as she could break the joint defense of the 2 magic-breaking knights with a thunderous momentum, the swarming vampires would definitely be able to directly engulf them. However, Mary, who was standing proudly at the top of the cliff, only glanced at the battlefield below with her scarlet eyes and no longer cared about it. She let the vampires under her be killed in large numbers, and she did not have the slightest intention of helping. The two magic-breaking knights who were standing together to resist the attack of the bat swarms revealed a look of anxiety in their eyes. The slightly older magic-breaking knight could not help but secretly peek at Mary. Seeing that Mary had no intention of joining the battle, he finally could not bear it anymore. With a deep roar, the middle-aged knight's aura abruptly skyrocketed. Berserk and turbulent runic energy converged on the rune sword in his hand. Finally, it transformed into a dazzling crescent arc that streaked across the sky and directly slashed at the top of the cliff where Mary was standing. Mary's body flickered slightly, and she left her original position. She spread her bat wings and floated in the air, slightly looking down at the middle-aged knight below her with a trace of disdain in her blood-red eyes. This was the most common battle technique of knights, the half-moon slash. The highly condensed rune energy exploded in an instant, and the intensity of the energy it brought was no less than a 150-degree witchcraft attack. If Mary did not dodge, that attack would have been enough to seriously injure her. It was as if a small sun had suddenly exploded on the top of the cliff, and the violent rune energy instantly collapsed half of the cliff. Rocks flew everywhere, and the cliff facing the group collapsed with a rumble. Countless broken rocks and tons of sawdust rolled down, directly engulfing the battlefield under the cliff. The two knights awkwardly escaped from the torrent of mud and rocks, and only after retreating 100 meters did they find a place that they could stand on. The middle-aged Radiant Knight's body emitted a glaring rune light. He looked at Bloody Mary, who was standing in the air from afar, and his eyes showed a thoughtful expression. Since Mary knew his identity as a Radiant Knight, why did she not retreat, even though she knew it was impossible? Could it be he did not have much time to think? In a forest 2 miles to the northwest, there was a sudden explosion of terrifying elemental waves that were far more powerful than the violent attack just now. The sudden explosion of magic flames and the terrifying elemental waves caused the middle-aged Radiant Knight's expression to change. "It's a fire demon," the young magic-breaking knight blurted out, his eyes filled with unconcealable fear. After these few days of bloody battles, the knights and magi had some understanding of each other. The most terrifying among the knights was undoubtedly the group of Radiant Knights. Although their mobility was slightly inferior, the powerful runic power also bestowed them with incomparable sharp attacks and indestructible defenses. Seriously speaking, if the Magi encountered a Radiant Knight, they could only retreat. There was no way they could win. On the side of the Magi, there were also some terrifying figures that appeared. For example, Bloody Mary, who was always surrounded by a terrifying flock of bats, or Intich, who could control thousands of poisonous insects, or some other terrifying magi with strange abilities. However, these were not as terrifying as the fire demon. When the terrifying fire demon, which was 3 meters tall and covered in crimson flames, stepped onto the battlefield with 2 other flaming puppets, the double fire spells and the self-destruction of the fire spirit were enough to instantly kill a magic-breaking knight of the same rank. Chapter 199. In the forest far away, flames burst forth, and raging flames raged. The pitiful cries of the mercenaries and the enraged roars of the magic-breaking knights could be heard clearly. The middle-aged Radiant Knight's expression suddenly changed. He could not be bothered with the Bloody Mary in front of him anymore, and rushed towards the battlefield in the distance. As one of the higher-ups of the Radiant Knights, he knew that the team of knights in the distance only had 2 magic-breaking knights. With such a formation against the terrifying fire demon, it was very likely that there would be heart-wrenching casualties. According to the analysis of ranks, the magic-breaking knights and magi were both at rank 1, and they both had the ultimate power to kill the other. In that case, the 2 magic-breaking knights should have the upper hand against a rank 1 magus. It was a pity that such an ideal comparison had never happened before. One side was an evil magus from a powerful plane, and the other side was a close combat knight from a weak plane. If the hindrance brought by the plane suppression was removed, a rank 1 magus would have the absolute advantage when facing a magic-breaking knight of the same rank. Weak magi might be afraid of the ghostly assassins, but when facing these thick-skinned meat shields, they obviously had the advantage in terms of their profession. Aren't you thick-skinned? If one spell can't hurt you, then I'll use 2. If 2 can't hurt you, then I'll use 3. As for close combat, no magus would be stupid enough to fight a magic-breaking knight in close combat. With the speed of the magic-breaking knights, wanting to catch up with a magic-breaking knight in a forest full of thorns and bushes was simply a pipe dream. Whether it was flame jump, shadow jump, or elemental wings of wind, magi had many ways to maintain a safe distance between themselves and the knights. Hence, there were only magi who kite the knights, and it was rare for the knights to surround and attack the magi. Of course, not all magi had the ability to move quickly. That was why in the first half of the month, there were already 3 magi who died in this line of battle. As for the rest, they all had powerful mobility and were equipped with powerful killing spells. Based on these 2 points, as long as they didn't run into a Radiant Knight, a Magus would have a 70% chance of winning in a clash between a Magus and a Knight of Destruction. As a result, the Wizard faction had lost 3 wizards, and the Knight faction had lost 22 wizards. Hence, when the Radiant Knight saw the terrifying fire demon massacring the elites on his side in the distance, he was enraged. While he was wary of Bloody Mary's sneak attack, he rushed towards the battlefield with all his might. But it was different from what he had imagined. The middle-aged Radiant Knight thought that Bloody Mary would try her best to tangle with him and create an opportunity for the fire demon. However, Bloody Mary did not care about his departure at all. Instead, she flapped her wings and flew towards the young Spellbreaker Knight behind him. This time, the middle-aged Radiant Knight's expression changed completely. At this point, he completely understood why Bloody Mary had appeared here. If he insisted on saving the 2 knights, the remaining knights would not be able to escape Bloody Mary's slaughter. But if he didn't, the roar of the flames in the forest in the distance became more rapid and wild. A scarlet pillar of fire that was close to white soared into the sky, engulfing the forest in a terrifying sea of fire. At the same time, an egg-shaped flame barrier appeared. It was the fire demon's signature flame barrier. The middle-aged Radiant Knight shook his head in anger and sighed. He turned around and rushed towards the female vampire who was circling around the young Spellbreaker Knight. Since the fire demon had even activated the flame barrier, the fate of the 2 Spellbreaker Knights could be imagined. Rather than saving the 2 subordinates who might have been killed, it was more important to protect the companions behind him. Looking at the Radiant Knight who was rushing back, Bloody Mary cursed softly. She could only flash away from the opponent's attack range. She might have the ability to kill a Spellbreaker Knight, but against a Radiant Knight who was a grade higher than her, she could only retreat. She did not dare to expose herself to the opponent. The Radiant Knights could fuse the rune energy from the outside world with the life energy in their body, forming a powerful knight battle technique that was similar to the external release of energy. This allowed their attacks to break away from the shackles of the weapons in their hands, giving them the effect of a semi-long-range attack. Moreover, because the concentration of energy was much higher than that of elemental spells, this semi-long-range knight battle technique not only had a strong ability to break through defenses, but could also directly annihilate or cancel out the spells cast by the caster. This was also the origin of the name Spellbreaker Knight. The Radiant Knight was undoubtedly more powerful than the Spellbreaker Knight. Their strength mainly lay in their ability to use rune energy to strengthen their bodies. The path they took was somewhat similar to the path of the Sorcerer World's Anatomy Refinery Sorcerers. However, the Anatomy Refinery Sorcerers used various poisons or extreme pain to strengthen their bodies, while the Radiant Knights used rune energy to make themselves more powerful in a short period of time. Although they reached the same goal by different means, both of them displayed the same powerful physical combat strength. That was why Mary could rely on her agile body to toy with the Spellbreaker Knight, but when she encountered the Radiant Knight, she could only turn around and run. Fight? With Mary's current strength, It was difficult for her attacks to break through the Radiant Knight's personal defense, which was a mixture of rune energy and life energy. On the contrary, once the distance was closed, the Radiant Knight could seize an opportunity to kill Mary on the spot. Mary's blood-red armor, which was infused with blood energy, could at most defend against 110 degrees of elemental attacks. The Radiant Knight could easily attack with more than 150 degrees of mixed attacks, which was more than enough to kill a close combat sorcerer like her. That was why Mary did not dare to step within 10 steps of the Radiant Knight. Looking at the cunning Bloody Mary, the middle-aged Radiant Knight's heart was filled with indescribable humiliation. This little sorcerer's strength was far behind his, but with her terrifying agility that far surpassed that of a normal person, even a grade 2 knight like him could do nothing about it. Although the Radiant Knight's attack power was strong, there was nothing he could do if he could not hit his enemy. While they were being delayed, the battle in the distant forest was nearing its end. When the terrifying forest fire spread everywhere, the sound of the fireball's explosion began to gradually fade, and then it became silent. On the many mountains, cliffs, and treetops in the forest far and near, countless pairs of eyes were silently watching the area where the battle had erupted. At the same time, countless sighs of sorrow sounded from the depths of the forest. Grimm did not care at all about the spying from the outside world. Above him were 7 or 8 wind breath monsters floating in the air, and below him were more than 10 earth demon puppets moving freely underground. Nothing within a 10-mile radius could escape Grimm's senses. It was precisely because of his extreme control of the battlefield that Grimm could fully utilize the demon puppet army's advantage in group battles and maintain extreme pressure on the enemies in a small area. Apart from unnecessary local mercenaries, the dozens of knight squads that were scattered in the forest were either 1 magic breaker knight and 2 magic hunter knights, or 2 magic breaker knights in a team. Occasionally, some Radiant Knights would mix in with the intention of luring the sorcerers to attack. This kind of combination was the best way to fight after half a month of bloody battles. There were more than 10 evil sorcerers wandering in the forest, and they usually fought alone. Apart from the necessary servants and summoned creatures, it was rare to see 2 sorcerers working together. The reason for this was probably because the sorcerers did not trust each other, and it was difficult for them to work together. However, once the knight squads formed a team that the sorcerers could not match, no matter how unwilling the sorcerers were, they would still form a team to attack. Therefore, after a few bloody battles, the higher-ups of the knight squad had no choice but to split the knight squad into smaller squads and play a game of cat and mouse with the sorcerers in the forest. Most of the time, the sorcerers were the cats, and the knight squad were the mice. Every time they encountered a sorcerer's sneak attack, the mercenaries in the team would die the fastest. As long as the knights did not encounter the terrifying demons, they could rely on their powerful combat power to fight and retreat at the same time. Under normal circumstances, their lives would not be in danger. However, if the attacking sorcerers were unlucky and encountered a Radiant Knight hiding in the team, the position between the cat and the mouse would be reversed. That was how the 3 dead sorcerers died in the hands of the Radiant Knights. Therefore, the sorcerers sent to intercept the enemy in the forest would either run fast, be unkillable, or have a good vision. As long as one of these could be taken care of, they would be able to keep their lives and not die in some dark corner. Grimm, on the other hand, had many elemental sentinels and his unique flame teleportation ability. Therefore, he was like a fish in water in this murky and dangerous quagmire of war. He was doing very well and was very proud of himself. When other sorcerers discovered the knight squads, they would have to carefully probe them repeatedly to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Radiant Knights. However, such caution could easily attract the attention of the target, turning a perfect hunt into a meaningless chase and slaughter. The knight squads cooperated with each other in the forest. Once they discovered that one of their comrades was being chased, the nearby squads would quickly rush over to rescue and support them. At that time, it would be the sorcerer's turn to run. Therefore, this kind of probing, counter-probing pursuit and counter-pursuit was often the most inefficient. However, Grim had many eyes and ears and could follow 2 or 3 different night squads at the same time. No matter how well the Radiant Knights, hidden in the enemy squads, disguised themselves, they would eventually reveal some clues under the 360-degree surveillance. Therefore, Grim had enough time to pick out a target that he could swallow in one bite, then set up a trap to ambush them. Due to the lack of unnecessary probing and hesitation, Grim, who went all out, was able to reap the greatest rewards every time. The prey that he had set his eyes on had no chance of escaping, so he did not have to chase them. As long as he controlled the surrounding squads and made sure no one came to disturb him, the 2 Knights of Destruction would not be able to stop him. If Grim's secret scroll of voodoo could be used at full strength once a day, and if he did not have to reserve half of his energy to deal with any changes, his killing speed would have been even faster. Chapter 200. A temporary campsite. The campsite was located in a pile of rocks. Rocks that were 2 to 3 meters high were piled up in a disorderly manner. It looked messy and disorderly, but it brought a sense of security to the campers in the camp. The forest was foggy. Although it was already late at night, the campers did not light a bonfire to expel the humidity, and no one was willing to talk. In the shadows of the pitch-black boulders, 3 to 5 adventurers wrapped themselves in thick beast skins and felt, trying their best to fall asleep. However, the scene they saw during the day was too shocking, so the people in the campsite found it difficult to sleep. "Shilul, do you think we'll be able to make it back alive?" Poer the hunter poked his friend from the same village and asked in the lowest voice possible. Zyro was an archer, and he was already the best archer in the village where they were originally from. Zyro turned over and did not answer his companion's question. Poer, however, vaguely noticed that his companion was trembling slightly. But he did not ask his companion for the reason, because at this moment his body could not stop trembling. The terrifying fiery man that was as tall as a demon, the terrible noise that shook the entire forest, the monstrous flames that seemed to swallow the heavens and the earth. Just like that, 2 knights and 3 to 5 mercenaries were buried in the sea of fire, becoming new ghosts of the evil wizards. And those people were probably countless times stronger than him. Every time he recalled the scene he saw in the afternoon, Poer felt his soul tremble. It was as if he had become the knight who was engulfed by the violent flames, and the only thing he could do was to raise his head and let out a mournful cry for the last time in his life. Under the pressure of the terror in his heart, Poer finally gathered his courage and asked the shadow on the other side of the campsite, "Lord Morse, can we go back alive?" Silence. "Do you want to summon those wizards?" Morse's soft rebuke came from the shadow, but his tone immediately became gentle again. "Don't think too much. Our mission is to explore the surroundings of Snakebird Cliff. Tomorrow, we only need to advance another 3 miles to complete the mission, and you will naturally be able to return to the campsite and receive the reward. That's 30 gold solons, enough for you to live comfortably for 10 years. Perhaps it was because he thought about the blissful life he would have after receiving the reward. The boulder in Poer's heart finally loosened. He once again wrapped himself in the thick beast skin, trying his best to keep his body warm. However, what Poer didn't know was that, just as he was trying his best to fall asleep, a basin-sized mound suddenly rose from the soil in the center of the campsite. As the soil at the top of the mound cracked, countless black scorpions spewed out from within. They divided into 5 black insect swarms and silently surged into the surrounding shadows. A moment later, Morse's angry roar was suddenly heard from the shadows. "Get up! Everyone get up! The evil worms are coming!" As the energy shield flickered, the flaming longsword in his hand began to explode. Relying on the blinding light of the flames, the simple and crude campsite was instantly illuminated. There were a total of 5 people in the camp. Other than him, there were 2 demon hunter knights and 2 mercenary hunters. Unfortunately, when the flickering light shone on the campsite, only he and 1 demon hunter knight could jump out of the blanket. The other 3 did not respond at all. Looking around, They could only see the wriggling beast skin mattresses and blankets. Damn it, Morse cursed angrily. Grab your weapon and prepare for battle. Actually, there was no need for his reminder. That demon hunter, Night Grim, had already swatted away the scorpions on his body and used his tenacious will to resist the waves of dizziness. He struggled to pull out his runic longsword. After the scorpions burrowed into the blanket, they kept stabbing him with their poisonous pincers, but strangely, he did not feel the slightest pain. If it wasn't for Morse's loud roar that woke him up, he would have probably died silently in his sleep like the other demon hunter knight. The blazing longsword stabbed into the ground, and a violent flame shock wave instantly swept through the entire campsite. Under the impact of Knight Morse's powerful explosive force, the scorpions that were rushing toward them were engulfed by the ferocious elemental flames. The entire campsite was filled with the shrill hisses of the insects. However, under the flickering illumination of the thousands of flames, the wormhole in the center of the campsite suddenly collapsed. More and more beetles, even bigger, gushed out of it. They gathered together and formed a terrifying wriggling pile of insects that rose little by little. Soon, a humanoid figure built by the terrifying swarm of insects appeared in the center of the campsite. Seeing the evil sorcerer's strange entrance, the two knights' eyes were filled with unconcealable despair. Their hearts were completely frozen, as if they were soaked in ice. The demonic insect in Titch had appeared, in a cave at the bottom of a cliff 12 miles northwest of here. A bright bonfire was burning brightly. The entrance of the cave was covered with a thick blanket, and there were wild vines outside the cave. There was no need to worry that the fire would be noticed by outsiders. Inside the cave, for people sat around the bonfire, silently wiping their weapons and armor. They were not interested in talking at all. Fortunately, they had arrived at this hidden cave under the guidance of a hunter before the sky turned dark. That was why they had a resting place where they could light a bonfire to drive away the humidity in the forest. Otherwise, they would not have dared to light a bonfire while camping in the wild. In this Greenland forest, which was deep and lush with foliage, any bit of fire could be clearly seen from more than 10 miles away in the darkness. Although there were no flying beasts or ferocious magical creatures in this forest, there were evil sorcerers that were far more terrifying than wild beasts lurking here. In the past 2 days, their small team of 4 had only traveled less than 30 miles in the forest, but they had already been attacked by no less than 15 wizard beasts. These wizard beasts wandered in the forest in groups of 3 to 5. Once they sensed the presence of humans, they would pounce on them without a care for their own safety like mad dogs. They could be plague dogs, wild bison, poison dart frogs. Of course, they had also encountered a strange monster that was the result of a combination of a pterosaur and a human spearman. None of these strange creatures were normal. They either carried terrifying plagues or viruses or were covered in blood. One look, and one could tell that they were terrifying, evil creatures that had been put together by a few kinds of wild beasts in the forest. They had relied on the powerful half-ranged flame blade of the Magic Breaker Knight to force their way through. Fortunately, although they had been attacked by many wizard beasts, they had not encountered those evil sorcerers. The southern part of the Greenland forest had undulating mountains and a vast sea of trees. It would be difficult for 2 people to detect each other even if they were 100 meters apart. Therefore, it was almost impossible for more than 10 sorcerers to completely block the infiltration of the small team of knights in such a large area. Therefore, it was not strange that they had not encountered any sorcerers along the way. However, in the afternoon, they saw a battle in the distance from a certain hill, which made them fall silent. A team that was almost as strong as their team was destroyed by the ambush of the fire demons. Deep down, the knights had a huge conflict with the higher-ups who had forced them to infiltrate the forest. But when they thought about it, if they did not have a specific target in such a vast forest, more than 2,000 demon hunter knights could only wander around aimlessly. At that time, just eating, drinking, and defecating for over 2,000 people would be enough to drag down the entire team, not to mention finding the enemy in the deep mountains and forests and fighting them. Therefore, even though there were demon hunter knights dying in pain in the depths of the forest every day, the higher-ups of the knights were still determined to carry out the infiltration plan. With the lives of more than 20 magic breaker knights and more than 50 demon hunter knights, the edge of the forest had been completely explored, and the sorcerer's line of defense was retreating step by step. Perhaps in another 3 to 4 days, they would completely explore the vast forest that spanned 200 to 300 miles and find the enemy's hideout. That would be the perfect time for them to destroy the evil sorcerer's hideout in one fell swoop. However, no matter how beautiful the idea was, they would have to sacrifice more and work harder to realize it. As for whether they could live to see that beautiful moment, the 2 magic breaker knights in the cave were still feeling a little uneasy. Just as everyone was staring at the flickering bonfire in a daze, there was a strange knocking sound coming from the cave's entrance. Thud, thud, thud. Is there anyone here? Who is it? A hunter blurted out in shock. Only then did he realize that they were in the middle of a barren mountain. Where did the door come from? Where did the visitor come from? A lonely traveler. If you don't object, then I'll come in. The voice outside sounded rather strange, wooden and hoarse, without a trace of humanity. Since you're here, please come in. There's no need to hide outside and play tricks. The magic breaker knight, Entos, slowly stood up, his energy shield and flaming sword glowing. Suddenly, he turned his head to look at his companion who was sitting beside him in shock. Haim, who was also a magic breaker knight, was still sitting where he was, the veins on his forehead bulging. His face was flushed red, and he gritted his teeth so hard that they creaked. "What's wrong with you?" Entos asked loudly. "I'm about to be controlled by someone." Nightheim's simple words were fragmented by him. After he finished speaking, even his eyes turned crimson. Knight Entos exerted all his strength to activate the flaming sword in his hand, and the sudden explosion of elemental flames instantly lit up the entire cave, as well as Haim. Behind Haim, who was sitting on the carpet, there were strange, translucent threads floating in the air. They all pierced into his body, while the other end silently extended to the cave wall. "Damn it, it's a puppet!" Knight Entos roared angrily, and a flame blade pierced through the air, directly cutting the 7 or 8 strange void threads. With the help of his companion, Haim finally broke free from the control of the threads behind him. He quickly jumped up and roared, "Everyone get ready. The evil sorcerer puppet is here." Chapter 201. Sorcerer's Camp. In a dark and gloomy stone room, there were 7 or 8 white stone tables in the empty hall, and on each of the tables were strangely shaped human and monster specimens. At the edge of the stone table, there were 2 to 3 magi, solemnly dissecting the specimens on the stone table. On a stone platform closest to the door of the stone room, a naked, muscular man was lying on his back. His entire body, from the lower jaw to the lower part of his throat to his crotch, was completely spread out like a book. The bright red flesh, the flowing blood, and the ferocious-looking sorcerer created an indescribably eerie atmosphere in the stone room. This man had a lion's nose, short black hair, square cheeks, and bronze skin that was full of luster. Looking at his bulging muscles and thick bone granules, it was obvious that he was a strength-type warrior who had undergone high-intensity training all year round. There was also a sword and shield tattoo on his left shoulder. If it were a local who was familiar with the customs of the Night Plane, they would definitely scream out in shock. This strong man who was being dissected was an official demon hunter knight. 3 sorcerers surrounded him. A sorcerer was using a sharp scalpel and a small saw to remove a bloody organ from the demon hunter's body, while the assistant sorcerer was casting spells to preserve the fresh organs and put them into containers filled with a dark red liquid. The third sorcerer was writing and drawing on a piece of parchment paper, recording in detail the abnormalities they found in specimen number 1. The demon hunter knight's body was still twitching as the dissecting sorcerer's scalpel gently pricked and stimulated by electric currents. The tip of his little finger was even twitching nervously. This meant that even though the demon hunter knight's internal organs were almost completely removed, his spiritual consciousness still existed, and he seemed to be able to feel the pain in his body. Test specimen number 1, Demon Hunter Knight, male, healthy, 32 years old. His organs are 89% similar to a normal human. Some organs have a slight tendency to mutate. Upper limbs have large bone granules. Skin is tough and tight. The strength of the flesh has reached the standard of a high-level apprentice. The heart, liver, and other internal organs have been found to have the tendency to assimilate and mutate with the foreign energy. The mutating effect is equivalent to that of magic organs. There are signs of excessive consumption of life energy. Initial suspicion is that it's caused by the erosion of foreign energy. Detection spells indicate that the test subject does not possess innate elemental abilities. The preliminary conclusion is that the Demon Hunter Knights have signs of both beginner body refinement and beginner demonification. In essence, they are more like human knights who have used runic energy to strengthen their bodies. Since they don't have any elemental talent, the rune energy is strengthening their body, but it is also rapidly consuming their life force. On a nearby stone platform, the Demon Hunter Knight's common mount, the Demon Colt, was also lying quietly on it. Its body had been cut into pieces. The sorcerers who participated in the dissection all revealed looks of disdain towards this magic colt. It was too primitive, too simple. The so-called devil colts were just hybrids between human warhorses and some special wild beasts. Then, during the process of raising and feeding them, they were constantly fed with drugs that stimulated the strength of their flesh and blood. This gave them some of the characteristics of jungle beasts, and their climbing ability was especially strong. Therefore, they became the standard battle mount of the Demon Hunter Knights. In the depths of the dark stone room, the ones placed on the stone platform were no longer ordinary Demon Hunter Knights. Instead, they were more valiant Magic Breaker Knights. However, at this moment, they had all become the evil sorcerer's test subjects. The deepest secrets hidden in their bodies were all revealed in a single glance. Compared to the ordinary Demon Hunter Knights, the Magic Breaker Knights who had successfully advanced had signs of innate elemental abilities. Moreover, some of their main physiological organs had been irreversibly demonized. Strictly speaking, the Magic Breaker Knights were a group of people who had talent in spellcasting but were forcibly turned into Magic Knights. Based on the known data, the sorcerers could not help but speculate that the Grade 4 Holy Knight who stood at the peak of the Night Plane must have an even more outstanding elemental talent. Unfortunately, he did not embark on the path of a spellcaster, but the path of a Magic Knight. If this speculation was correct, it would mean that the Grade 4 Holy Knight was no more than a half-baked sorcerer who had gone astray. Of course, with the lack of elemental energy in this plane, it was understandable that he had given up on the path of a sorcerer and embarked on the path of a Magic Knight. After all, the development of the plane was not complete or abnormal, and it was not something a native of this plane could control. To be honest, to be able to break through to Grade 4 in such a small plane with such a lack of elemental energy, his talent and potential were simply amazing. From the data collected from the dissected test subjects, it could be seen that the ordinary Demon Hunter Knights were just a group of half-baked Magic Knights who had been infected by rune energy. Their strength was basically equivalent to that of an intermediate to advanced sorcerer apprentice. The Grade 1 Magic Breaker Knights, on the other hand, were a group of real Magic Knights. Their physique was similar to that of a quasi-sorcerer in the sorcerer world, but with the help of rune equipment, they had sorcerer-level attack and defense. This was also why the Magic Breaker Knights were always at a disadvantage in actual combat, even though they were of the same rank as sorcerers. One had to admit that the Night Plane was a small plane. It had gone through thousands of years of development and evolution. Although it had nurtured its own unique power system, it was still far inferior to the sorcerer world in terms of rank and strength. In the Greenland forest, the wandering level 1 sorcerers dared to ambush the team of knights led by the Magic Breaker Knights. This showed the huge difference in rank and strength between the two sides. On one side was a large plane with a terrifying reputation that resounded throughout the multiverse. On the other side was a small, isolated, and weak material plane. These two different planes seemed to have the same definition of a level 1 life form on the surface, but when they were put together, there was a huge difference in strength. Of course, the sorcerer spent so much effort to dissect and study the Demon Hunter Knights, not only to collect information and data, but also to cultivate the most suitable plague and virus for the Demon Hunter Knights. As the only native force in the Night Plane that could fight against the sorcerers, as long as the Demon Hunter Knights were eliminated, the remaining indigenous people would not be able to fight against the sorcerers who had mastered the ultimate power. Thousands of human troops were a joke in front of the sorcerers. A simple plague spell could turn a large country into a country of death in a month or two. Without the protection of extraordinary power, the power of mortals was nothing in front of the sorcerers. So, right below the stone chamber, a large worm farm and a runic energy research room had been built. With a large number of Demon Hunter Knights' flesh and blood samples, a special plague worm that fed on runic energy was being cultivated. Once the worm plan was successful, the sorcerers might be able to kill the group of abominable Demon Hunter Knights who prevented them from taking over this plane without bloodshed. At the same time, the construction of the Sorcerer Tower was advancing rapidly. At present, the construction of the Sorcerer Tower had been completed for the first 4 floors, and the top of the tower was about to extend out of the coverage of the illusory barrier. Therefore, in view of the current situation, follow-up construction activities had to be suspended, and they were prepared to wait for the situation to calm down before continuing. Due to the special nature of the construction of the Sorcerer Tower, it was impossible to complete the construction of the floors one by one. The main body of the Sorcerer Tower had to be completed before the engraving of the spell formations could be done, and then all the spell formations would be combined into a complete tower defense system. If necessary, a large-scale sorcerer ceremony would be needed to activate the tower spirit to complete the integration of the entire War Wizard Tower's resources. Such a complicated task could not be completed under the nose of the enemy. Therefore, in order to increase their chances of victory, the sorcerers had to resort to their old tricks, which were voodoo. Grimm stood alone on the top of a high cliff, quietly looking down at the dark forest hidden under the thick night sky. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the stars and moon were dim. This was a great night to kill. Just as he stood there quietly, for visible elemental disturbances had occurred in the forest near and far. The most violent one even blew up half of the mountaintop. Even Grimm, who was 30 miles away, could feel the heat waves from the raging elemental flames. The shock waves blew off his hood, revealing his calm and stern face. The 4 explosions of elemental disturbances did not occur at the same place, but in 4 different areas. The frequency of each explosion was different, and the elemental auras contained within were also slightly different. With the AI chip's efficient data collection and information comparison ability, Grimm could even deduce the identity of the Magi involved in the battle through the elemental auras carried by the wind. The one fighting 7 miles to the southwest was the demonic worm in tech. It had to be said that his strength had improved by leaps and bounds over this period of time. Out of the 4 night raids, the battlefield he was in was the most silent, and the elemental auras that he could identify were the least. If not for Grimm's great foresight and the AI chip's powerful abilities, he might have overlooked the aftershocks of his battle. A battle had also erupted 15 miles to the east, between the body-tempering Magus Keel and 2 Magic Breaker Knights. The 2 Magic Breaker Knights had paid the price of 1 death and 1 serious injury before retreating from the battlefield. Keel had also suffered some injuries and could only let go of the injured knight. Grimm could not help but feel sorry for him, and secretly passed this good news to Mary, who was wandering in the forest far away. The battle 30 miles to the northeast was the most intense. The Magic Breaker Knight, who had been forced into a dead end, had self-destructed. As for the method of self-destruction, it was similar to Nyinti's. Grimm could not help but wonder if all the Magic Breaker Knights had mastered this annoying method of self-destruction. The one who had forced the Magic Breaker Knight to self-destruct was a strange magus called Marionette, who seemed to be able to control other people's bodies. However, The first 3 battles were not the focus of Grimm's attention. The only thing he was concerned about was the battle 45 miles to the northwest. Chapter 202. In the previous battle, 3 wizards had died to the sneak attacks of the Radiant Knights. This was a huge loss for the Solubo family. After all, the Solubo family's bottom line for this plane expedition was 8 magi. If they lost too many magi in the Knight's plane, the Solubo family's ranking in the Tower Forest region would be greatly affected. If the Solubo family were to transfer magi from 2 subsidiary planes to fill in the gaps in the family's headquarters, it would be a huge blow to the stability of the 2 subsidiary planes. Therefore, Forgan, the only rank 2 Magus in the Magus camp, had no choice but to personally take action against the Radiant Knights. He planned to give these magic knights a ruthless blow. Tonight was a night without light. The Magi became extremely active. Other than the 10 Magi who had been roaming around the killing line, Forgan had brought another 5 Magi into the battlefield. The unlucky Radiant Knight had already been picked out, and the rest of the squads around him were naturally dealt with by other Magi. Thus, the Radiant Knight, hidden in a squad, naturally became Forgan's target. It was obvious that Forgan did not trust Grimm and the rest. He had even brought a few of his trusted subordinates to clear the battlefield, and did not allow other Magi to get close to the battlefield. Grimm, who had long since wanted to pry into the secrets of rank 2 Magi, could only use this method to gather information. Ever since he had become a rank 1 Magus, Grimm had been filled with uncertainty about his future. Before he had a clear direction to move forward, before he had collected enough information, he did not dare to rashly try. This information was naturally difficult for new Magi to come into contact with. At the very least, before Grimm signed an even tighter service contract with the Solubo family, he would not be able to come into contact with them. Hence, at this time, if he could gather some information about rank 2 Magi, it would undoubtedly be a beacon of hope for Grimm's path as a Magus. This way, even if he did not have a way to advance, as long as he had a clear direction, Grimm could rely on Chip's powerful calculation abilities to deduce his path forward. Violent winds howled in the blood-red night. Standing on the high cliff, the night wind that swept over from afar brought with it a hint of bloody slaughter. If Mary was here, she would definitely shout to the sky in excitement. Grimm thought to himself in boredom. His eyes were fixed on a certain spot in the darkness, and a blue light flashed in his pupils. The battle had already begun. He could already smell the ice particles in the night wind, as well as a small amount of fire particles. By now, Grimm could tell that the rank 2 wizard Forgan's innate spell was a mutated ice spell. Its attack power was so strong that it could almost completely suppress that Knight of Radiance. At the end of the day, the Knights of Light were just a bunch of magic knights with super high magic resistance. Their greatest strength was their resistance to elemental sorcery. As for themselves, due to the lack of systematic training and meditation, they could not freely control the elemental particles in the world. Hence, they could only rely on runic energy to attack or defend. The so-called rune energy was nothing more than using some simple rune arrays to guide the mana within the mana crystals and then applying it to weapons or defensive equipment. In the wizard world, these things could not even be called magic items. At most, they could only be regarded as enchanted items. The price-to-performance ratio was way lower than magic items. However, there were specializations in every field. All the rune arrays in the night plane revolved around how to make the rune energy in the night more closely. Therefore, when it came to combining the rune energy and the source energy of life, the rune arrays here had their own unique points. Not to mention anything else, Grimm was also interested in capturing a Knight of Radiance to investigate the mysteries of the rune arrays on their bodies. Once he obtained their knowledge of the rune arrays, Grimm was confident that he could improve the energy system of the magic puppets. Even the Balrog transformation tattoo on Grimm's body could be improved. The dark night sky was suddenly illuminated by the blue fluorescent light, and a huge ice ring that could be seen with the naked eye suddenly exploded in the mountain forest. The surrounding tall, ancient trees were instantly frozen in a sparkling and translucent world of ice crystals. The sound of ice crystals colliding with each other could be heard. Grim could not help but admire the power of a rank 2 wizard. The night plane was a small material plane that lacked elemental energy. The same rank 1 spell in the wizard world could have an attack effect of up to 100 degrees. However, in this plane, it could only have an attack of around 70 degrees. Moreover, the attack range and duration of the spell would be greatly reduced. Fortunately, most of the wizards that came from another plane had many magic items, scrolls, and wands to use. With the many instantaneous spells, they could still overwhelm their enemies with numbers and maintain their class advantage against knights of the same rank. The battle under the night sky lasted for half an hour before it was completely over. The result was just as expected. Wizard Forgan had a complete victory. When the victorious wizards returned to the wizard camp with their bountiful spoils of war, Grim was finally able to see the scene of the battle in person. It was on the back of a small hill surrounded by 2 or 3 boulders. There was a flat ground with a radius of only 20 meters. For a team of adventurers, this was the perfect place to camp. Unfortunately, this place had turned into a world of ice and snow. Grim walked out of the dark forest and wandered around this world of ice and snow. His eyes, which were hidden under the shadow of his hood, flashed with a pale blue light. All of his senses were activated, including his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. He did not miss a single trace of elemental energy in the camp. The 3 meters tall boulders were covered in a thick layer of ice crystals. Even the fireplace in the middle of the camp, including the firewood and the bonfire, were frozen in a ball of ice crystals. With a light knock, a crisp sound could be heard. Its sturdiness was no less than that of normal steel. Through the translucent ice crystals, one could vaguely see the shape and color of the bonfire. The bright red flame, the scarlet red flame core that was almost white, seemed to have suddenly stopped flowing, and they were frozen at a certain moment. Fire and ice, the power of ice that could even freeze flames, also contained traces of the power of laws. Otherwise, it would be impossible for 2 types of elements that countered each other to coexist. Next to the boulder, there were 2 human mercenaries lying on their sides. Their faces were still filled with fear. One of their hands was holding onto the weapons on their waist, and the other was on the ground, ready to get up. Unfortunately, their lives stopped at that moment. As soon as Wizard Forgan barged into the camp, he immediately unleashed a terrifying ring of frost and got rid of everyone who was in his way. On the other side of the camp, the traces of the explosion were getting more and more obvious. Grim kept scanning the battlefield for clues, and an earth-shattering battle scene gradually emerged in his mind. Following the traces of the battle, Grim kept going deeper into the forest. Finally, he found the place where the battle ended 3 miles away. Almost half a mile of the forest had been razed to the ground. There were crisscrossing ravines everywhere. The bottom of the ravine was scorched, and there was a faint black smoke rising from it. From the many scorch marks left behind by that Night of Radiance's powerful night battle technique, one could tell how intense the battle was. But now, these scorch marks were covered with a layer of crystal-clear frost. It showed Wizard Forgan's complete control over the entire battle. At this point, that Night of Radiance might have been frozen in place by Wizard Forgan. It was hard for him to move, and all he could do was passively defend against Wizard Forgan's attacks. This could be seen from the angle of the attack and the location of the explosion. The Night of Radiance's magic resistance was very high, but it still couldn't withstand the continuous attacks of spells. With Wizard Forgan's battle experience, he would never give his opponent a chance to replace the mana crystals in the rune circle. Grim stopped at the center of the battlefield. There was an ice pillar that was half a meter tall. The top half had been shattered, but the bottom half was still as hard as steel, emitting a dark blue glow. This was the place where the Night of Radiance was defeated and captured. Grim sensed the ice pillar from a close distance. There was still Wizard Forgan's personal elemental scent, but there seemed to be something else. It's worth taking it back and studying it. Having made up his mind, Grim took out his flame scepter and summoned the fire djinn. He then used the crystal core to summon a rock python. As soon as the fire djinn appeared, it began to set everything on fire. Very quickly, everything on the battlefield was completely destroyed. The giant rock python opened its mouth and directly swallowed the ice pillar and the frozen ground. Afterward, it dove into the ground. After looking around the battlefield and making sure he didn't miss anything, Grim turned around and left. As the night breeze blew, the wantonly spreading forest fire burned all the remnants with crackling sounds. When the battlefield was completely scorched, the soil at the edge of the fire started to split open. Tens of thousands of black beetles rushed out, once again forming the shape of evil bug and tick. Damn it, that bastard has already been here. Looking at the charred land, the rising black smoke, and the unextinguished embers, Tick cursed angrily again. However, he immediately looked up at the pitch-black sky. He couldn't tell if that bastard had left any strange eyes or ears here. Chapter 203. The death of a Radiance Knight on the battlefield was no less than a super earthquake to the Demon Hunter Knights. In the past 1,000 years, there had never been a Radiant Knight dying on the battlefield. Of course, this was partly because it was difficult for the wild evildoers to reach the level of a Radiant Knight, but it was also because of their powerful combat power. Without the accumulation of knowledge and systematic inheritance, the naturally awakened evildoers had powerful talents and enviable development potential, but they could not find a place to learn systematic sorcery knowledge. Moreover, under the cruel suppression of the Demon Hunter Knights, once their identities were discovered by outsiders, they could only conceal their identities and live a precarious life of wandering from place to place. Under such circumstances, most of the naturally awakened evildoers in the Night Continent were limited by the lack of knowledge and resources and could only wander around the sorcerer apprentice level in pain. Even if there was a rare genius who unexpectedly advanced to become a grade 1 spellcaster, it was difficult for them to gain an absolute advantage when facing a group of Demon Hunter Knights. If they encountered those spellcasters, they could only die in despair. Therefore, there had never been a spellcaster who could threaten the Radiant Knights in this world. But now, with the appearance of a powerful invader, this situation was completely broken. The enraged knights were divided. Some of them requested for everyone to remain calm and continue to explore the remaining areas steadily so that they could find the lair of the invaders as soon as possible. Some of them were infuriated, thinking that the previous battle strategy was too conservative and that it was tantamount to sending their elite forces to be slaughtered by the enemy. Both sides quarreled over this, and neither side gave in. The 2 grade 3 Dragon Knights needed to escort the injured Green Dragon back to the Dragon Cliff, and were currently not at the night camp. Therefore, under the deep conflict that was difficult to resolve, the Demon Hunter Knights finally split up. The radical faction could not take it anymore. They gathered nearly 1,000 Demon Hunter Knights and rushed into the Greenland Forest without hesitation. For a time, the entire border of the Greenland Forest was filled with ferocious demonic cults with their necks raised and neighed. These terrifying beasts, which looked like a hybrid between a warhorse and a demonic wolf, carried many Demon Hunter Knights on their backs and galloped through the dense forest as if they were flying. Whether it was a rugged mountain stream or a high cliff or a gurgling river valley, they could pass through all of them as if they were walking on flat ground. 7 Radiant Knights led 34 Magic Breaker Knights and 828 Demon Hunter Knights to form a powerful combat team, using the Magic Cult's extraordinary climbing ability. They advanced through the forest like a tornado. Meanwhile, those terrifying wizard beasts that were constantly gushing out from the depths of the jungle also fell to the ground and turned into piles of minced meat under the knights' violent attacks. In an instant, nearly 1,000 Demon Hunter Knights and a large number of wizard beasts started a massacre in the forest, turning the forest within a 10-mile radius into a bloody slaughterhouse. This was a terrifying battlefield in the depths of the forest. The demon hunter knights arrived at this place. In front of them was a high cliff, and on the left was a dense forest. Only on the right was the terrain a little more relaxed, and the trees were a little sparse. Thus, naturally, the vanguard of the party turned around and went to the right side of the cliff. However, just as the party of knights turned around, thousands of wizard beasts surged out, and in an instant, the party was in disarray, and it was difficult for them to take care of each other. On the cliff, in the dense forest, at the bottom of the cliff, in the forest, in the valley behind. In every area of the region, demon hunter knights and wizard beasts could be seen fighting in groups of 3 to 5. The strange sounds of swords cutting through flesh and bones, the sound of blood splattering, the angry roars of the knights, the terrifying roars of the wizard beasts, and the violent and ferocious combat skills of the knights. There was not a single quiet spot near the cliff. Burly figures wielding swords and blades were everywhere, and hideous and terrifying wizard beasts were everywhere. Grim, who was wearing a black robe, was like a terrifying grim reaper wandering the world in this chaotic battlefield. While he enjoyed the bloody and cruel slaughter before him, he looked for the most suitable battlefield for himself under the guidance of the wind breath monster. There were more than 18 sorcerers like him in the surroundings. Ever since the news of the Demon Hunter Knights coming out, the sorcerer camp finally sent 9 sorcerers over, bringing the total number of sorcerers gathered on the killing line to 19. Sorcerers rarely formed groups of 3 to 5, like the Demon Hunter Knights. Since young, the sorcerers were trained differently, so they were used to fighting without any restrictions. Moreover, they were never at ease leaving their backs to another sorcerer. That was why they always fought alone. Even though Grim and Mary had gone through many life and death situations together, they would still fight on their own if there was no need to, and rarely would they take the initiative to team up. Perhaps this was the survival instinct of the sorcerers. Grim was leisurely strolling along a river. On the other side of the river was a group of hundreds of demon hunter knights fighting an equal number of wizard beasts. At the cost of the deaths of 3 demon hunter knights, they did their best to annihilate this group of wizard beasts. When Grim passed by in his black robe, there were only a dozen or so lion and tiger beasts left on the battlefield, struggling to survive. There were 5 spell breaker knights in this group of knights. When they saw Grim's strange black robe, they immediately roared and led more than 30 demon hunter knights towards him. There was a distance of more than 70 meters in a small river that was 5 to 6 meters wide, but it was not enough to stop their charge. Grim looked at the enemies who took the initiative to provoke him, shook his head expressionlessly, and chose to avoid them. He might be able to take down such a group, but the price he would have to pay was too high. There was another group of knights on the other side of the hill, and there were 2 knights of radiance in it. If a battle broke out here, and he could not end it quickly, it would be very easy to attract the attention of the 2 knights of radiance. To Grim, the knights of radiance were not enemies he could deal with. Therefore, Grim stretched out his right hand that was hidden under his robe, and a lava ball the size of a basin shot out from his flame scepter. He then threw it at the charging team of knights. The expression of the leading spell breaker knight instantly changed, and he exchanged glances with his companions beside him. Both of their flame swords shot out wide flame blades at the same time, intercepting the dark red fireball that contained terrifying elemental waves above the river. Bang! A deafening explosion sounded. The violent flame wave cut the river in half, and in an instant, the boiled water droplets shot in all directions like bullets. The charging knights hurriedly put up their energy shields, and after a series of clanging sounds, they finally blocked the round of attacks unscathed. But when they put down their energy shields, and when the steam gradually dissipated, they could no longer see the figure in the black robe on the other side of the river. It's the fire demon. It's him. Hurry up and inform everyone that the fire demon has been spotted, and tell everyone to be careful. While the few spellbreaker knights were trying their best to spread the news, Grim had already appeared in a low valley half a mile away. Here, a team of 30 or so demon hunter knights were doing their best to defend against the continuous attacks of 3 dragon knights. Fortunately, there were no spell breaker knights Radiant Knights, or Dragon Knights in this team. Therefore, seeing such a delicious meal, Grim no longer hesitated. The Lord of the Flames and Djinn of the Fire appeared at the same time, and they immediately rushed into the team of knights fearlessly. Since there were no strong enemies here, Grim did not transform into a fire demon. He was purely fighting in his sorcerer form. At this moment, with the terrifying strength of Grim's puppets, the Lord of the Flames and Djinn of the Fire could easily take down the group of demon hunter knights in front of him. However, considering that there were too many uncontrollable factors in the surroundings, Grim decided to end the battle quickly and join the battle. A sorcerer puppet, a quasi-sorcerer elemental creature, and a sorcerer who specialized in fire. The three master pyromaniacs rushed into the battlefield and immediately plunged the area into a sea of fire and continuous explosions. Chain of fireballs, meteors raining down from the sky, and a flaming storm that engulfed almost half of the battlefield. The bombardment almost instantly put the team of Demon Hunter Knights in a situation of life and death. The Demon Hunter Knights at the center of the explosion did not even have the chance to fight back before they were blasted into pieces by the terrifying spells. Only the Demon Hunter Knights at the edge of the battlefield could raise their energy shields and charge out of the sea of fire with their charred demon colts. However, what awaited them outside the battlefield was the lava fireball that Grim had casually tossed out. The elemental fireball was the size of a wash basin and covered in a layer of scorching lava, dragging a long tail of black smoke behind it. It rushed into the remaining team of demon hunters and only exploded when it collided with one of the Demon Hunter Knights. Broken pieces of lava flew everywhere like bullets, and the terrifying lava in the core of the lava fireball splashed out, covering an area of 10 meters in an instant. Not all humans could immerse themselves in magma, like Grim, without a change in expression. The boiling crimson lava was at least 2,000 degrees Celsius, and any demon hunter who was splashed by it would be instantly scalded. Their flesh, blood, bones, and even their demonic steeds would quickly melt like hot wax into a lump of unrecognizable charcoal. The Demon Hunter Knight's magic resistance was not enough to resist the violent sorcery that had been strengthened multiple times. Chapter 204. The series of explosions naturally attracted a group of Demon Hunter Knights. There were also many Spellbreaker Knights and Radiant Knights among them. However, when they arrived at the battlefield with their demon colts, all they saw was a bloody battlefield that had yet to be extinguished. The ground was filled with deep pits and scorch marks left by the explosion of the lava fireballs. The once boiling lava had already solidified into dark red lava. However, the remaining heat had yet to dissipate, and the battlefield was still filled with scorching heat waves. As for the small team of 30 knights, apart from a few broken limbs at the edge of the battlefield, most of them had already been devoured by the lava and flames, making it difficult to find them. As for the culprit, he had already escaped from the battlefield and disappeared without a trace. Everyone reined in their demon colts and stared at the horrifying scene that resembled doomsday with their eyes wide open. The anger and resentment in their chests burned like boiling lava, causing them to feel pain. "Pass down my order. Gather the troops and maintain a tight formation. We can't continue fighting like this. Get all the knights to gather at the center." A radiant knight, with a white beard and a determined look on his face, roared. Behind him, a large flag with a sword and shield was fluttering in the wind. Shortly after, the low and melodious sound of a horn began to echo in the forest. Just as Grim turned a corner at the foot of a hill, he saw another battlefield on a gentle slope filled with green grass. A dozen or so Demon Hunter Knights were lying on the ground in a disorderly manner in the forest. An evil short figure was strolling among them, as if he was searching for something. Hearing the commotion, the short figure stood up straight and looked at Grim with a pair of dull, lifeless eyes under the shadow of the hood. "It's a puppet. It's a fire demon." Although both parties did not have much contact with each other, they were still on the same side. Therefore, when they bumped into each other on the battlefield, they only nodded at each other and planned to pass each other by. However, at this moment, the low and melodious sound of a horn traveled along the mountain. Although the two could not understand the message conveyed by the horn, the fact that the Demon Hunter Knights chose to blow the horn at this time meant that they were planning to shrink their formation. The enemy is preparing to shrink their formation. How about it? Let's go and have a look. Grim looked at the direction of the horn and took the initiative to invite them. Once the other party shrank their formation, although their movement speed would be much slower, the safety factor would definitely be much higher. If the wizards wanted to continue their sneak attack, the chances of encountering the Knights of Light and Spellbreaker would be much higher. At this time, it wasn't a bad thing to have a comrade by his side to restrict the number of enemies. This marionette was also a veteran magus. His elemental affinity was with the plant element, but he had strangely turned his entire body into wood. According to legend, his special ability was to use puppet threads to control other people's bodies. To be honest, it was a rather strange ability. Hearing Grim's suggestion, the puppet pondered for a while and finally nodded in agreement. Without another word, the two of them turned around and rushed in the direction of the sound of the horn. Although they verbally promised to become partners, Grim never tried to approach the marionette wizard, and the marionette wizard did the same. From start to finish, both sides maintained a distance of at least 30 meters. This was actually an unwritten rule between magi. Once on the battlefield, any creature within 30 meters of a wizard would be regarded as an enemy, even if it was a comrade of the same faction. For a wizard like Mary, who specialized in agility, if she came within 50 meters of any wizard, she would attract a strong reaction and hostility from the other party. It had nothing to do with hatred. It was just a way to protect oneself. After all, 30 meters was the minimum distance that most wizards could react to a crisis in time. If they got any closer, some of the weaker elemental sorcerers would be worried that they would be instantly killed by the body refinement sorcerers or some strange spells. Trust? This term did not even exist among magi. Perhaps if a wizard allowed you to get within 30 meters of him, it was already the greatest trust he had for you. If you want to get closer, unless you were a slave or a weak wizard that he could completely control, it would mean an undeclared war. The two of them quickly ran in the forest. Every 5 seconds, Grim would suddenly disappear in a sudden burst of elemental flames. In the next second, he would appear in an open space in the forest about 200 meters away. The puppet wizard obviously had some special mobility abilities. Every time he advanced a certain distance, he would inexplicably crash into a tall, ancient tree. It was like a drop of water merging into a stream, without the slightest bit of delay or stiffness. Soon after, his body would emerge from the trunk of another tall, ancient tree 100 or 200 meters away. The whole process was natural and smooth, and no one could sense any elemental aura fluctuations. This was in stark contrast to his stiff and inflexible body movements, causing others to frown deeply upon seeing him. Of course, with the cautiousness of magi, they would never reveal their true situation when their companions were by their side. For example, Grim would always use flame jump in a fixed interval of 5 seconds. However, no one knew if this was the case. If someone targeted this, it was very likely that they would find something even more surprising in a life or death situation. Although both of them were silently rushing forward, they were secretly observing each other and gathering information bit by bit. This did not mean that one of them wanted to do something to the other, but it was just an instinct that wizards had developed after being cautious for a long time. If they gathered more information, they might be able to save their lives at a critical moment. Grim was obviously puzzled as to how this puppet wizard was able to complete a short-distance teleportation without anyone noticing. However, with the help of the powerful AI chip, he quickly discovered the puppet wizard's little secret. With his powerful elemental vision, Grim was surprised to find that the puppet wizard's short-distance teleportation was not completely random. In each of the tall ancient trees that appeared and disappeared, Grim could see a ball of witchcraft imprint that contained a person's aura. These sorcery imprints hidden deep inside the ancient trees were like waypoints, acting as spatial guidance, so that the puppet wizard would not lose his coordinates and direction at all. No wonder he could move through the forest so easily, without any trace of smoke or fire. It turned out that he had hidden his elemental aura in the countless ancient trees. This was not a bad train of thought and idea. Since he had seen through the puppet wizard's secret, the mysterious feeling that lingered in his heart was no longer there. Grim smiled leisurely and continued on his way. While he was silently spying on the puppet wizard was also secretly spying on his every move. Flaming Leap was a very simple fire element movement spell, but only those who understood it would be able to understand it. The advantages and disadvantages of Flaming Leap were very obvious, causing fire element magi to both love and hate it. The advantage was that it could teleport quickly. As long as there was no elemental barrier, it could freely teleport within one's field of vision, and the buffer time was very short. The disadvantage was that the teleportation was accompanied by too obvious a spell signature. Before the teleportation, one had to summon a large ball of elemental flames, and the teleporter's body would disintegrate within the flames. After the teleportation, a ring of flames would explode in the area that the teleporter had chosen, and the teleporter's body would reassemble in the flames. It was a very simple fire element spell, but the entire process was accompanied by a huge roar of flames and a dazzling ring of flames. Magi's enemies didn't even need to see, they just needed to follow the sound to easily find them. Speaking of which, it would be very difficult not to find such a large ring of flames that had suddenly exploded. Therefore, the concealment of Flaming Leap was simply too poor. Among all the short-distance teleportation spells, it was undoubtedly the most eye-catching. For a magus, being eye-catching meant being exposed, and being exposed meant being in danger. This was something that all magi tried their best to avoid. However, what the puppet wizard really couldn't understand was how Grim could master Flaming Leap so quickly. Although Flaming Leap was a simple spell, there was a very basic requirement for it to be cast. That was the elemental transformation of the body. This was a hard requirement that could not be avoided. Without elemental transformation, it would be very difficult to disintegrate and reassemble in the elemental flames. Without the disintegration and reassembly of the body, how could Flaming Leap cross a distance of a few hundred meters in an instant? Therefore, Flaming Leap was the exclusive skill of fire element magi. But how many years had it been since Wizard Grim advanced? According to the family's information, he had advanced less than half a year ago. How did he complete the elemental transformation of his body in such a short time? Could it be that he was already elemental converted before he became a wizard? It was precisely because he knew too much that the puppet wizard was entangled with countless questions in his mind, and it was difficult for him to find the right answer. However, every sorcerer's own ability was their most secretive wealth. Outsiders were not allowed to covet it. So the puppet sorcerer could only suppress his many questions in the bottom of his heart and quietly hurry on with his journey. Along the way, the two of them also met some other companions. Everyone simply nodded in greeting before silently joining the group. Very soon, this small team of 5 magi arrived at the target area. This was a slightly flatter and spacious valley. Although it was still filled with ancient trees and lush foliage, there weren't many shrubs and vines in the forest, so it became a temporary gathering point for the knights. Groups of demon hunter knights rushed over from all over the forest and gathered here. The noise of people and horses neighing could be heard clearly from miles away. In the middle of the forest, the flag with the sword and shield fluttering high in the air was inserted into the ground. Under the flag stood 7 especially strong and tall demon hunter knights. Around them were more than 30 knights in bright armor and majestic auras. Chapter 205. 5 sorcerers dared to challenge 7 radiant knights, 32 spellbreaker knights, and nearly 1,000 demon hunters? Of course not. However, the sorcerers still sneered in disdain at the many knights that were gathering. This was the natural disdain that spellcasters had for fighters. If this were a duel, the 5 sorcerers would not be able to defeat a radiant knight, even if they joined forces. However, sorcerers were strong in their terrifying mobility and strange sorcery. As long as they had a large strategic space to maneuver, even a level 1 sorcerer would not be afraid of a group of radiant knights. Although the magic cults under the radiant knights had good survival skills and leaping and climbing abilities, they could not compare to magi in terms of speed. The radiant knights had powerful close-range combat abilities, but they could not keep the vampire-like evil sorcerers at a distance of 100 miles. If the radiant knights charged at them, the sorcerers would definitely scatter like birds and beasts, maintaining a distance as they try to lure them into the depths of the forest. However, if they were to pursue them relentlessly, the group of demon hunters behind them would become the targets of other sorcerer sneak attacks. It had to be said that in this primitive forest with complicated terrain and harsh environment, it was difficult for the demon hunters to fully utilize most of their advantages. On the contrary, the sorcerers, who were free and could come and go as they pleased, had the biggest home advantage. They could attack at any time and escape at the slightest sign of danger. As for the large number of wizard beasts scattered in the forest, even if they were slaughtered by the knights, the sorcerers would not feel the pinch. Sometimes, the sorcerers would even deliberately send hundreds or thousands of wizard beasts to their deaths, just to create a chance for themselves to launch a sneak attack. Hence, when the Radiant Knights saw that there were quite a number of evil magi moving around the side of the team, they could only chase them away, not daring to pursue them too much. The Radiant Knight, who died in battle last night, was enough to prove that there was a powerful existence hidden among the evil sorcerers that could kill a level 2 knight. Any Radiant Knight who acted alone would no longer be as safe and worry-free as before. Looking at the demon hunters who had gathered in a row, the sorcerer's expressions did not look good. It was definitely not a problem to ambush a few demon hunters. However, once the enemy gathered into an army, the risk that they would have to bear to launch a sneak attack would be difficult to estimate. Any instructions from the camp? Wizard Felicia, who had a pair of wings of wind on her back and was wrapped in a layer of wind particles, asked in a deep voice, "You don't want us to attack an enemy team that has the protection of the Knights of Light, do you?" The sorcerers nearby and far away nodded in agreement. It was obvious that they were wary of the upcoming battle. Grimm quietly looked around. He found that the wizards who agreed were the same as Felicia. They belonged to some of the more obscure professions. There were no combat wizards among them. Farrell walked the path of an arcane sorcerer, and her research direction was focused on potions. If it wasn't for the fact that she also had some wind spells, she was afraid that a sorcerer like her who didn't focus on combat would be the first to die in the plain battlefield. As for the rest, they either focused on illusions or spell formations. Like Felicia, they were not good at fighting on the battlefield. Forcing them onto the battlefield was a waste of their talents. However, the Cerubo family was currently short on manpower. If they wanted to take down the Knights plain in a short period of time, they would not be able to do so with just a small number of combat wizards. Therefore, with the mandatory conscription order, these arcane sorcerers who spent most of their time in witchcraft laboratories had no choice but to step onto the battlefield. For the sake of the family, for the sake of their own lives, they had to fight with all their might. Although they did not gain much in the first half-month of fighting in the forest, their very existence was a huge hindrance to the demon hunters. Therefore, combat wizards like Grimm, Mary, the demonic worm, Puppet, and Thunderbird were able to find an opening and launch surprise attacks, taking the opportunity to kill many of the Spellbreaker Knights. Among the 5 wizards gathered together, Puppet was undoubtedly the closest to the Tier 2 wizard Forgan. Therefore, everyone could not help but look at him. There's no need to fight to delay. Until dark, the camp has a move. The lignification of Puppet's flesh had obviously affected his throat. Not only was his voice hoarse and dry, but the way he spoke was especially unbearable. However, the meaning behind his words was simple and clear, which made everyone feel slightly relieved. They were all sorcerers with many tricks up their sleeves. Now that they had a clear plan of battle, they could naturally come up with a plan. We can't let them gather together so easily. Grimm took a step forward and said coldly, "Help me hold them off for 30 seconds. I'm going to disrupt the order of their formation." Without waiting for an answer, Grimm threw out a crystal core to summon the Lord of the Flames. His body then expanded, and flames erupted as he quickly transformed into a Balrog. Grimm, who had transformed into a Balrog, stood side by side with the Lord of the Flames. They started chanting forceful incantations. Under their joint efforts, the clear sky was quickly covered by the gathering of fiery clouds. The fire clouds were about an acre in size, rolling and vibrating in the sky, casting a dark red hue over half of the sky. Bubbles of red lava the size of wash basins swelled in the fire clouds. As more and more fire and earth elements gathered, the fire clouds could no longer bear the weight of the bubbles. Thus, it only took 23 fingers to form a large-scale meteor shower. As the first bubble burst, a lava ball the size of a human head with fire elements in it fell towards the forest where the demon hunters were gathered, dragging a long tail of black smoke behind it. Then came the second one, the third one. Up in the sky, black and red fireballs swayed and fell one after another, leaving scorch marks in the air that did not dissipate even after a long time. "Damn it, these evil sorcerers!" The radiant knight with white hair and beard ordered loudly. "Musel, you lead the team and leave first. Regroup as you move. Don't let the team get separated by the enemy's wizard beasts. Collier, Arns, the two of you attack with me. Let's slaughter that Magus kid who's not afraid of death." As the orders were passed down, the team of knights that were gathered in the forest finally moved out. The one leading the team was Musel, who was holding the flag of the demon hunters high up in the sky. At this moment, the first batch of fiery meteors had already reached the top of the trees. Fire, following a series of loud shouts, rune arrows were shot out one after another, exploding the falling meteors above the treetops. Even if there were some that slipped through the net, the spell-breaking knights who rushed over on horseback would swing their swords, and a terrifying flame blade slashed out, splitting the core of the fiery meteors into two. The fiery meteor exploded into a rain of fire and scorching lava. But without the powerful physical lethality, the remaining flames were not enough to threaten the safety of the demon hunters. One by one, the demon hunters raised their left hands up high, using their energy shields to block the raining flames. They patted their magic colts and quickly retreated from the area. Under the leadership of their temporary leader, Charles, two radiant knights spurred their magic colts with all their might, charging towards the fire demon that was still in the channeling stage of witchcraft. To powerful knights like them, a distance of 1.5 miles was but a matter of seconds. Seeing the three radiant knights charging towards them, the other 4 sorcerers looked at each other. Even though they were unwilling, they could only grit their teeth and stop them. Puppet was the first to act. In just a flash, his stiff body had already appeared beside the 3 radiant knights who were galloping at full speed. Without saying a word, he stretched out his hands from under his black robe, and the ends of his hands, which were covered in strange wooden patterns, pierced out countless thin threads like spider silk. With his attack power, it was pure wishful thinking to ambush the radiant knights. Hence, the target of the threads was not the radiant knights on horseback, but the magic colts they were riding. Thousands of wooden threads scattered all over the sky. Although they looked weak and fragile, once they came into contact with a human body, they could easily penetrate it, even ignoring the armor on the target's body. The leading knight, Charles, snorted angrily, and the rune sword in his hand shone brightly. Immediately after, a wide and terrifying half-moon slash shot out. The sharp tip of the blade aimed at Puppet's chest. A level 2 radiant knight attacked with all his might. The momentum and power of the attack naturally exceeded the limits of a level 1 sorcerer's personal defense. As soon as the half-moon slash left the longsword, Puppet looked down in horror and found that a faint white mark had appeared on his chest, which was covered in circles of wooden patterns. This white mark gave him a heavy sense of oppression, to the extent that it had already cut through his skin and started to penetrate his body. As for Puppet, he felt as if his soul had been locked on by the other party, and that the half-moon slash would almost certainly hit him. This was clearly an illusion, but Marionette believed it without a doubt. Damn it, Puppet roared in his heart. This is the power of faith. The energy crazily surging into the wooden threads became more and more violent. Suddenly, more energy threads spread out from each of the wooden thorns, covering the sky and earth as they surged towards the three magic colts. Puppet himself quickly retreated, his body suddenly crashing into a tall, ancient tree and disappearing in an instant. Most of the wooden thorns and energy threads that filled the sky were dispersed by the violent energy of the three radiant knights, but there were still a few that pierced into the magic colts. The three magic colts let out mournful cries, and their galloping figures suddenly slowed down. The terrifying half-moon slash spun in the air, and with a speed as fast as a clap of thunder, it chopped down the tall, ancient tree that the puppet was hiding in. Then, with a burst of energy, it exploded into sawdust that filled the sky. Amidst the violent coughing sounds, the puppet staggered and fell out of another tall, ancient tree 100 meters away. Countless fine cracks appeared all over its body, and with the slightest movement, wood shavings would fall to the ground. Puppet supported himself against the ancient tree and struggled to stand up. He raised his head and looked at the radiant knight with resentment. Sticky green snakes of blood slowly flowed out of his eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. His appearance could be said to be extremely tragic. With the strength of a level 1 magus, Puppet being able to escape with heavy injuries was already an extraordinary feat for a level 2 Radiant Knight. If it were any other magus, they would not even have the chance to escape. Chapter 206. Wizard Felicia soared into the sky. A few test tubes were thrown far away, smashing into the path of the Radiant Knights. A large amount of purple liquid seeped into the soil. In less than 2 seconds, the ground suddenly trembled, and a large patch of purple thorns rose from the ground. Thorny tentacles as thick as a child's arm spread out in all directions, and the thorns on them flashed with a mysterious luster that was neither gold nor wood. In the span of a few breaths, the thorny forest that had suddenly appeared had completely blocked the group of magi behind them. It was a pity that such a wall of thorns could not stop the Radiant Knights from advancing. Streaks of thick half-moon slashes shot out close to the ground, plowing a deep trench in the ground along the way. Everything in their way, be it the sturdy rocks or the thorny wall, was sliced into two by the crescent moon slash, making way for them. As for the remaining 2 wizards, before they could cast their spells, the 3 Radiant Knights had already broken through the obstacles and appeared in front of them. They could no longer attack their enemies. The 2 wizards immediately gave up on the spell they were about to cast and escaped the path of the Radiant Knights. This way, they naturally gave up on Grimm, who was still in the channeling period of his spell. Although Grimm was in the channeling period, he was still paying attention to the performance of the other wizards. The puppet wizard's performance surprised him a little, and Wizard Felicia's performance was normal. As for the last 2 wizards, it was worth thinking about. Even if they were not combat wizards, they should at least have 1 or 2 simple and practical spells, right? However, they had given up on blocking it so easily. It was obvious that they had ulterior motives and wanted to use someone else to do their dirty work. Of course, if Grimm was the main body of this meteor shower, and the Flame Lord was the support, Grimm would definitely have to bear the majority of the spell's backlash if he abruptly stopped the channeling. In a life-and-death situation like this, if he was just a little bit slower, he would be separated from his life and death. However, how could Grimm make such a mistake? Without changing his expression, he forcefully stopped the channeling of Meteor Shower. The only side effect was that the magic flames on the Flame Lord's body suddenly became sluggish. 2 or 3 pairs of eyes that were hidden in the shadows of the forest suddenly darkened, and they all revealed expressions of frustration and resentment. Damn it, this Grimm was really cunning. He was not the one who had triggered such a powerful spell, but the elemental puppet. This way, if he forcefully stopped the spell, most of the backlash would be borne by the elemental puppet, and the damage to his body would be negligible. Grimm did not have time to think anymore. He stabbed his hand into the Flame Lord's body and grabbed the summoning crystal core. Then, a ring of flames suddenly exploded, and he disappeared on the spot. His front foot had just flashed to his original position when the violent of the cross explosive cross slash exploded the ground. Immediately after, the 3 radiant knights tightly reined in their strong and agile magic colts, stopping in front of the rock and mud pillar that shot up into the sky. Although they didn't kill a single wizard, they succeeded in interrupting the evil wizard's spellcasting. Without a powerful mount, it would be extremely difficult to chase after a group of wizards with all sorts of tricks and strange methods. Even a peak rank 2 Radiant Knight, like him, would not be able to come out unscathed if he fell into a wizard's trap. At the very least, the powerful Green Dragon in Heduran City was a good example. In all fairness, although Radiance Knights and Green Dragons were both Tier 2, a Tier 2 Green Dragon could easily defeat 3 to 5 Radiance Knights. The Green Dragon had a huge body. Therefore, with the same base of strength, the strength and vitality that it obtained was too overwhelming for a human knight, who was a small creature. Moreover, the Green Dragons could fly, breathe, and had dragon scales with astonishing defensive power. With all these advantages stacked together, they could even challenge a Tier 3 knight. Such a terrifying Green Dragon, under the protection of so many knights, had been beaten half of its body by a few magi who had sneaked in. It had almost lost its life in Heduran City. As a last resort, according to the giant dragon agreement signed between the Kingdom of Knights and Dragon Cliff, the 2 dragon knights could only escort this Green Dragon day and night back to Dragon Cliff's location, Dragon Valley. Therefore, during this period of time, the Radiant Knights were the only ones left in the camp. Due to the lack of a strong person, many Radiant Knights could not come to a consensus. Thus, they split up. One group stayed behind, while the other went to the extremes. This led to the current situation. Should I drive them further away? The Knight of Annis could not help but ask with a solemn face. It's no use. Charles looked at the surrounding forest and shook his head. I can sense that there are still some evil magi hiding in the forest nearby. If we leave for too long, I'm worried that something will happen to the main group. Forget it. Let's not bother with these annoying bugs. As long as we find their nest, I don't believe they will run away like this. The 2 Radiant Knights, Collier and Annis, nodded in understanding, agreeing with Charles's opinion. The 3 of them did not chase after Grimm and the others. They turned around and patted their magic colts, chasing behind the main group and disappearing into the depths of the forest. Grimm used Flame Leap and reappeared on top of a hill closest to the puppet Magus. Although they were separated by more than 70 meters, Grimm did not have any intention of getting closer. Since the puppet was already heavily injured, moving closer to it would inevitably arouse suspicion and hostility. Therefore, Grimm stopped far away, a gentle smile appearing on his face. Your body is not badly injured, is it? Do you need any help? The puppet turned its dull eyes and stared at Grimm for a while, before shaking its head with difficulty. Shortly after, it walked in a strange manner to a tree that was as wide as 5 people's arms and stabbed its hands into the tree trunk. As the green aura flashed, the cracks on the puppet's body healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. On the other hand, the tall ancient tree couldn't help but shiver. Countless green leaves on the originally lush canopy began to rapidly wither and turn yellow before falling to the ground with rustling sounds. In the blink of an eye, this tall, sturdy, and vigorous ancient tree had reached the end of its life. It looked like it had experienced the vicissitudes of life and was withering away. By the time the puppet pulled its hands out of the ancient tree, the wounds on its body had all disappeared, and it was full of vigor again. Of course, these were only superficial signs. As for whether this puppet magus had suffered any internal injuries, it was not something that could be easily guessed. In a magus group, if any member showed any signs of fatigue or weakness, it was equivalent to shouting at the other magi to fire at me. Perhaps in the next battle, this weak member would become the target of the other magi, along with the enemy. In this kind of battlefield, as long as one was careful, it was normal for a magus to die. Hence, sometimes, magi were even more terrifying and savage after they were injured than before. The main reason was that if he did not do this, once other magi saw that he was weak, he would be in endless trouble. In the world of magi, only by being more savage and ruthless than others could you intimidate those who harbored ill intentions. Many times, the companions hiding behind were far more terrifying and deadly than the vicious enemies. An injured magus did not need sympathy or help, but disregard. Only when everyone did not pay attention to him would he have the chance to hide in a corner and slowly lick his wounds. Grim nodded at the puppet and did not say anything else. He listened to the terrifying thunder in the distance and left with a flame leap. It seemed that another magus was launching a sneak attack on the knights. Judging from the way he attacked, it should be the combat magus nicknamed Thunderbird. Only when Grim's flaming aura disappeared into the dense forest did the puppet magus heave a sigh of relief. While he was confronting Grim, his right leg had been silently inserted into the soil. If Grim dared to move within 30 meters of him, the roots that broke through the soil would definitely be able to shackle him by more than 5 fingers. At that time, the puppet could choose to fight or hide according to its own will. Puppet's body trembled slightly, and the large roots that had pierced into the soil quickly retracted back into his right leg. He turned his lifeless wooden eyes and stared stiffly at a bush 100 meters away. He then turned around and entered a large tree at the side, never to be seen again. After a full quarter of an hour, when the clearing in the forest had completely quieted down, the soil in the bush that Puppet had been staring at before he left began to bulge and crack. The demonic insect in Titch slowly condensed into a body. He closed his eyes and sensed for a moment. After confirming that there were no traces of Puppet's unique and strange soul undulations in the nearby forest, a trace of resentment appeared in Titch's green eyes. A black insect shell, a sinister mouth like a lotus petal, and strange compound eyes of various sizes stacked on top of each other. Compared to the last time he had appeared, Titch's insectoid features were becoming more and more obvious. This time, there were even 2 small black feelers protruding from his insect-like head. A strange purple glow flickered faintly on top of them, as if they had some kind of special sorcery ability. Even though he knew that these veteran magi were all cunning and had strange methods, Titch, who had approached Puppet with the intention of giving it a try, was still discovered. The look that Puppet had given him before he left was obviously a warning. However, to the fearless demonic insect Titch, such a warning was not something he would take to heart. Titch spun his insect head and focused his attention on the distant battlefield that was rumbling loudly. After listening for a while, his body suddenly slumped and disintegrated into thousands of strange black insects. They once again burrowed into the ground, stealthily heading in the direction of the battlefield. When the forest quietened down once more, a pair of eyes suddenly opened on the thick trunk of an ancient tree. It blinked a few times and glanced at the wormhole left behind by the demonic insect. Immediately, a mocking smile flowed out from the pair of strange eyes before it slowly disappeared. Chapter 207. It was extremely difficult for the Demon Hunter Knights to advance through the forest. With the speed of the Demon Colts, if they ran at full speed, it would not be a problem for them to travel 30 to 40 miles in an hour. But if they did that, the formation of nearly 1,000 Demon Hunter Knights would undoubtedly become very loose. If they were to be attacked by the numerous shaman beasts that were lingering in the surroundings, then the entire group would instantly fall into disorder and become like a plate of loose sand. Moreover, the only ones who could stand on their own were the 7 Radiant Knights. While there were many demon hunter knights, they were just moving delicacies in the eyes of the sorcerers. The spell-breaker knights could fight against the evil sorcerers if they worked together, but if they were alone, they would attract many wolves at any moment. To keep the team compact, the demon hunter knights had no choice but to slow down under the restraint of the radiant knights, traversing through the forest in a leisurely manner. All the creatures in the Greenland forest had disappeared, all transformed by the sorcerers into terrifying wizard beasts of various sizes. Apart from that, some of the hidden witchcraft traps in the forest also caused quite a bit of trouble for the team. The quicksand traps and gravity traps were still manageable, but the fireball traps, acid traps, and poison cloud traps were enough to kill the demon hunter knights. The terrifying sorcerers had used their evil wisdom to the extreme. The witchcraft traps were buried in the path of the knights, and there were many ways to trigger them. Some of the traps were buried underground, and when the rocks above were touched, a small fireball would fly out from the ground. It was not very powerful, but it was not a problem to burn a demon hunter knight and his demon colt into charcoal. Some of the traps were set up on branches 3 to 4 meters above the ground. Once the hanging vines were pulled, the highly corrosive acid would sprinkle down head-on. Some poison cloud traps had very strange conditions to trigger. It would only explode when a certain amount of life force was near it. Therefore, when the demon hunters riding on their demon colts slowly passed by, they would always see charred corpses on both sides of the road. Some of the corpses had their heads corroded into beehives, and some of their companions were dyed in strange colors. The dead comrades were placed by the side of the road, and after a prayer, they continued on their way. However, those who were seriously injured or poisoned couldn't be abandoned so easily. With the burden of these injuries, the knights' advance became even slower. From time to time, loud shouts from the patrolling knights could be heard from the periphery. Whenever this happened, there would always be some inexplicable and strange sorcery that would descend from the sky and land on the team. It could be a low-level lava fireball, a terrifying poisonous cloud, or a huge acid swamp. Most of the spells were destroyed by multiple rune arrows before they could even land. Even if there were some that managed to escape, they would be destroyed by the flame blades of the knights who rushed over. Although the danger they brought was not that great, it kept all the knights on edge. As they rode high up on their demonic colts and traversed through the forest, their vigilant eyes kept scanning the bushes, the treetops, and the piles of rocks. Even if they were in the middle of the group, it wasn't necessarily safe. This was because from time to time, there would be wizard beasts that were adept at concealment, pouncing out from the dense canopy of trees or the messy rubble. If they were caught off guard and were scratched by their black, filthy claws, even with the physique of a demon hunter knight, it would be difficult for them to resist the biological poison that the evil sorcerers had carefully modified. An ordinary forest road that was less than 20 miles long took them 2 hours to walk, and they had lost as many as 16 non-combat members. Especially the 7 or 8 companions that were infected with the poison, they could only tie them to their demonic colts and barely follow the team. When the sun rose high in the sky and it was afternoon, a new problem arose. They were a lone army, and they had a strong belief that they would not turn back until they found the enemy's lair. That was why they rushed into the Greenland forest without hesitation. Therefore, every member of the Demon Hunter Knights only brought 3 days' worth of rations and drinking water when they set off. If it was a simple adventure, this equipment would be enough for them to search the vast forest that was nearly 200 square kilometers deep. However, after continuous cruel battles and bloody killings, they might have enough rations, but they were obviously overdrawn on drinking water. What was more frightening was that along the way, they were furious to find that almost all of the drinkable streams and springs had been occupied by the undead creatures that were emitting a pale yellow plague poison cloud. This also meant that all of the surface water sources had been seriously polluted and had become undrinkable. Humans were not machines, and it was impossible for them to maintain a high level of vigilance and combat readiness for a long time. Although the physique of the Demon Hunter Knights was several times stronger than that of ordinary people, after 5 to 6 hours of cruel fighting and arduous trekking, their physical strength inevitably fell to rock bottom. As a last resort, the higher-ups of the Demon Hunter Knights set up camp on a high hill so that the exhausted knights could have a safe place to rest. Many of the magic-breaking knights formed groups of 3 to 5, forming patrol teams that wandered in the nearby forest to prevent the despicable sorcerers from causing trouble. As for the 7 Radiant Knights, they gathered in a small tent that was temporarily set up and discussed the follow-up plan. The lair of the evil sorcerers was located in the southern part of the vast Greenland forest that was 200 kilometers deep. After the previous bloody investigation, the Demon Hunter Knights had used their lives to sweep away nearly half of the suspicious spots. Now, in front of the 7 Radiant Knights was a vast forest that spanned nearly 100 square kilometers. The Radiant Knights who could sit here were basically fanatical radicals who abhorred evil as if they were their mortal enemies. Otherwise, they would not have been so infuriated by the fragmented investigation methods that they could not stand and rushed into the forest without hesitation. According to their previous plan, they did not have to care about the scattered sorcerers at the edge of the forest. The army would charge into the core area of the forest like a hot knife through butter. Then they would set up camp there and spread out their men in all directions, and they would definitely be able to find the enemy's lair easily. Even if there were casualties, it would be much less than sending outstanding magic-breaking knights and teams of elite Demon Hunter Knights to the slaughter. It had to be said that the oppressed evildoers in the Plane of Knights had deeply engraved the image of the weakness and timidity of the spellcasters into the hearts of all the Demon Hunter Knights. Even the higher-ups of the Demon Hunter Knights had never seen the invading evil sorcerers as a mortal enemy. To them, the sorcerers were a group of sinister and cunning people who were good at hiding and sneak attacks. As long as they destroyed their foundation in one fell swoop, they would be like a group of rats that had their nest blown up. All they knew was to hide in a panic, and it would be difficult for them to organize any large-scale resistance. In essence, this group of radical Radiant Knights used such a simple and violent method to deal with the invading evil sorcerers. It was the most suitable and fastest method. However, they had overestimated their own strength and underestimated the sorcerer's means. If they could mobilize their army, if they could gather all the powerhouses of the plane, then the simplest and most violent method would undoubtedly be the best way. Unfortunately, the powerhouses of the plane of grade 3 and above were absent. Coupled with the internal conflicts that had led to the division of the Night Knights, these 2 points had greatly weakened the combat strength of this isolated army. Therefore, when this group of Radiant Knights gathered together to discuss their next step, the counterattack from the sorcerer's camp had already arrived. In the afternoon, the horde of terrifying magical beasts had completely surrounded the hill where the knights were resting. Then, under the command of the evil sorcerers, large groups of sorcerers broke into the cordon set up by the knights and started a cruel and bloody massacre. In the vast forest, there was a loose defense line that stretched for 2 to 3 miles. 7 Radiant Knights led a group of Spellbreaker Knights, each occupying a side, resolutely and tenaciously destroying the waves of terrifying sorcerers. On top of the high hill, there was a temporary camp for the injured. The demon hunters who were too severely injured to continue fighting were sent here to wait for treatment. Due to the lack of necessary treatment methods, the temporary demon hunters who acted as the rescue team could only use a dagger to cut off the rotten or stiff muscles, wash the wounds with a large amount of water, and bandage them. This method may be useful for ordinary skin wounds, but most of the injured knights in the camp had been attacked by the claws and teeth of the sorcerers that were infected with the virus. Before the virus was expelled from the bodies of the knights, not only would their wounds not heal, but they would also worsen and fester as time passed. This was also because the demon hunters had strong bodies. If it were an ordinary human warrior, the blood in their body would have already coagulated, and their flesh would have rotted to death. Yet, they could still fight the virus tenaciously. However, this also extended the time of their painful struggle. The sorcerer's attack lasted from the afternoon until the sky gradually darkened. After 4 hours of continuous attack, Tens of thousands of sorcerers fell at the forefront of the battle, and the combat strength of the demon hunters had decreased from the initial 700 to less than 400 now. Relying on the valiant mounts and the powerful runic equipment, the demon hunters did not really lose many of their combat strength, even though their combat strength was greatly reduced. After 4 hours of continuous battle, 87 demon hunters had died in battle, but the number of knights who were attacked by the sorcerers was as high as 235. Even the knights who were still guarding the outer perimeter were all injured, but not to the extent that they could not get up. More than 10,000 sorcerers had died, and almost half of them were killed by the 7 Radiant Knights. Moreover, during the first hour of the battle, every time a series of sharp and domineering half-moon slashes plowed out a bloody path in the group of wizard beasts, the number of wizard beasts that were killed or injured had been rising. After an hour of continuous slashing and slashing, they also had to throw the Berserk Knights' combat skills into the densest areas of the sorcerers. Even the Radiant Knights could not withstand such a high-intensity battle. At the beginning of the battle, they would unleash a terrifying crescent slash every 3 to 5 minutes, but later on, they would only unleash it once every 2 to 4 minutes. In the end, their blood and chi were in turmoil, and they could not activate the powerful knight's combat skills anymore. Therefore, they could only fight like ordinary demon hunters, relying on their powerful strength and strong physique to fight the sorcerers. The number of sorcerers was not endless. In the past month, the sorcerers had hunted almost all the wild beasts and magical creatures in the forest, transforming them into sorcerers in large numbers. But in just one day, they had already lost 70 to 80% of the less than 1,000 demon hunters. Chapter 208. When night fell, the battle gradually came to a stop. The fearless and tireless wizard beasts retreated under the command of the sorcerers and hid in the forest far away. It was difficult to figure out their intentions. Looking down from the high hill, the dark forest was filled with the eyes of the wizard beasts, some green and some scarlet. Charles, with his white hair and beard, stood at the corner of the high hill with the rune longsword in his hand. He looked at the surrounding forest from afar. His heart felt like it was weighed down by a 1,000-pound boulder. Even breathing was difficult. Seriously speaking, almost all of Gao Gang's Demon Hunter Knights responded to his call to fight. Now that everyone was trapped on the high hill, they could not move and could only wait passively for the sorcerer's follow-up attack. What were the sorcerers planning by hiding in the dark? Could this group of people successfully resist the enemy's attack and wait until the enemy's strength was exhausted? His chaotic thoughts kept spinning around in his mind like a horse lantern, causing him to be lost in thought for a moment. Footsteps sounded behind him. Charles did not need to turn around to know who it was from the familiar footsteps. Sure enough, Mussel's calm and loud voice sounded. The enemy has retreated for the time being. The injured knights have just settled down. Charles's determined face became gloomy, and he said in a low voice, "How are the casualties on our side? How many knights can still fight on horseback?" After a moment of silence, Mussel's voice also became low. "There are about 386 people who can still fight on horseback. The rest..." In the first chaos after entering the forest, the demon hunters lost almost 100 people to the sneak attacks of the sorcerers. In the arduous journey, another 20 to 30 knights fell on the road. After the long, bloody battle in the forest, there were only 386 knights left. Didn't that mean that the knights had lost more than 300 people in the battle just now? Although most of the casualties were due to the biological toxins on the claws of the wizard beasts and lost their combat power, it was no different from dying on the battlefield when surrounded by enemies. It was even to the extent that on many occasions, these fellows who were heavily injured and on the verge of death would rather die under the claws of shaman beasts. After all, the Demon Hunter Knights had always been known for their fierce attacks and swift movement on the battlefield. Now that they were dragging more than 300 injured people on their backs, how could they break through the enemy's encirclement? The rest of the Radiant Knights also gathered around, waiting for their leader Charles's orders with resolute eyes. The muscles in Charles's face began to tremble slightly. It was so easy to give an order, but behind every order was a mountain of bloody corpses of demon hunter knights. As the leader of the knights, he knew very well what kind of order could save the lives of the remaining demon hunters. But when the words reached his mouth, his grizzled beard trembled, and he still couldn't say them. Abandoning his companions. Abandoning their comrades. Since when did the knight's maxim, which the demon hunter knights had always followed, become a number that could be added and subtracted on paper? Seeing the difficult and painful choice of the leader, the more pragmatic Muscle said calmly, "It's impossible for everyone to break out. We can't abandon the wounded here. So, Charles, take some people and break out. I'll stay with them and continue to defend. You take some people back to the camp and ask for help. Winsole and the others won't leave us in the lurch." When he said the word ask for help, Muscle's words also became difficult. As a proud Radiant Knight, making Charles bow to the stubborn and conservative Winsole was undoubtedly another and more difficult battle. However, the current situation forced him to say it. The muscles on Charles's face twitched even more violently. Finally, the leader of the radicals made up his mind and said resolutely, "No, Muscle, I shouldn't be the one to go back. I should bear the greatest responsibility for today's reckless advance. So I have to stay and stabilize the morale of the army. You, Collier, Arns, Jose, the four of you will lead 200 people back to ask for help. You can tell Winsole that as long as he's willing to help, I'm willing to hand over all my authority." The scene suddenly fell into a dead silence. Every radical's face revealed a pained and struggling expression. With Charles's order, it meant that from now on, the radicals would forever be inferior to the conservative knights. For the proud and arrogant knights, this was something more painful than death. However, just as everyone's emotions were in turmoil, an extremely terrified scream suddenly came from a corner of the high hill. Soon after, like a storm sweeping over, the entire camp was filled with cries of pain. "What are you guys panicking about?" Muscle drew out the brilliant rune longsword and shouted, "Stay calm. The enemy hasn't." Before he could finish speaking, his expression suddenly changed. Unknowingly, an unpleasant stench of decay had entered the camp along with the night fog that filled the forest. It was like a shepherd boy blowing a bewitching piccolo. When the stench spread throughout the camp, the wounded who were lying on the high hills and dying suddenly experienced a terrifying change. The knights could clearly see that in the open space closest to them, an injured person with a weak breath suddenly began to convulse violently. His originally pale face suddenly flushed red, and he gritted his teeth so hard that they creaked. Milky white foam continuously gushed out from his mouth and nose. His eyes were wide open, and because he used too much force, even the corners of his eyes were broken. Purplish-black blood gushed out from his eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. His body began to twist and contort into various unimaginable forms. After spitting out the blood, he began to scratch his body with all his might. He used so much force that the skin on his face and body were all bloody and mangled. A demon hunter knight in charge of taking care of him wanted to stop him, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not stop him from harming himself. Instead, he was bitten on the arm. All the Radiant Knights possessed extremely strong physiques, but at this moment, they could vaguely feel a trace of discomfort. They looked around in panic, and finally found the culprit that caused the chaos in the camp. Fog. No, to be more specific, it should be some kind of mysterious substance that had blended into the fog. The injured knights in the camp were undoubtedly the weakest in terms of physique and spirit. Hence, some of the mysterious black particles in the fog could be seen swimming into their wounds like fish. As far as the eye could see, the injured on the high hill were all surrounded by thick black smoke. Amidst the black smoke, the injured knights struggled in pain, tearing their armors and inner linings, and even scratching their own flesh until it was dripping with blood. It looked like they were about to tear their own skin off. As the black smoke blended in, the appearance of these injured suddenly changed drastically. The skin on the surface of their bodies began to melt, and the bright red muscles and tendons were directly exposed to the air, causing everyone to become bright red. But gradually, the color of blood began to fade, and a sticky and disgusting liquid began to fill the surface of their bodies, causing them to become wet again. The thick muscles and tendons gathered together, and the insufficient stretching caused their bodies to become thin and hunched. However, the strength of their bones and muscles was clearly much stronger than before. They were roaring angrily. At first, they were like mournful wails of humans, but later on, they became more like wild beasts, and only strange hee-hee sounds were left. Sharp fangs, sharp claws, and spines on their backs began to grow rapidly. When their claws subconsciously scratched a piece of rock, there was a crisp sound, and dazzling sparks exploded. Right in front of the Radiant Knights, on this high hill, a wounded knight who was on the verge of death actually completed his undead transformation. He was forcefully transformed by a powerful evil force into an undead creature that had never appeared in the night plane before. A ghoul. After completing the undead transformation, this ghoul turned over and crawled on the ground. Its eyelids suddenly flipped, revealing milky white and turbid eyeballs. It was so white that no pupils could be seen. Although it did not have pupils, this did not hinder the ghoul's vision. Its special life perception made it especially sensitive to the aura of life. It opened its mouth, revealing its sharp fangs, and let out a low and threatening roar at the Radiant Knights. Its body bent slightly, and its strong hind legs stomped on the ground with great force. This ghoul pounced at the Demon Hunter Knight closest to it like a sharp arrow. The Demon Hunter Knight was clearly stunned by the scene in front of him. He retreated in fear, but could not think of drawing his sword to fight back. This was a comrade that he was once familiar with. As a Radiant Knight, Marcel had undoubtedly experienced far more terrifying and strange things in his life than the young Demon Hunter Knights. He quickly broke free from his shock and fear and rushed forward. He held a sharp sword in his hand horizontally and slapped the body of the leaping ghoul with the flat of the sword. "Get down!" As he roared, the ghoul was sent flying, and it crashed into a small tree that was as thick as a human's waist 10 meters away. The sound of bones cracking could also be heard from the ghoul's body. But this blow clearly did not make the ghoul lose its ability to fight. The ghoul rolled on the ground a few times, and when it got up again, most of the bones on the front of its body were already broken. But it actually struggled to get up without a care, dragging its twisted and slanted body towards Marcel again. "Die!" Marcel finally recognized reality and no longer held back. The sword in his hand flashed, and like a sharp knife cutting through paper, it silently cut the ghoul in half. But when the sword cut through the ghoul's spine, he felt a slight obstruction in his hand, and his expression changed slightly. He was a grade 2 Radiant Knight. If even he felt a slight obstruction when slashing this monster, what would happen to the other Demon Hunter Knights when they encounter monsters? You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.